So today we are actually going to cover a lot of ground. We're going to learn how to set up a full stack application. And I think what we'll use is the to-do app from yesterday, that full stack app, and deploy it onto AWS. So we're going to talk about understanding what it means to deploy a site on the internet we're going to use the cloud, the AWS cloud. And I'll talk a bit about that. We're going to see configuration and setup that has to happen for our application, both for our Django code and for our React code. We're going to see how to create a virtual machine, a virtual computer on AWS and authenticate to it and connect to it with SSH, which is, I think, secure shell. So we can have a command line in there so we can install stuff. And we're going to set up some dependencies. It's going to be an Ubuntu Linux virtual machine. We're going to learn a little bit about a server Nginx that is going to become the server for our React app instead of Vite Dev Server. We're going to learn about Gunicorn and why we need to use it with Django, how to kind of connect up Nginx and Gunicorn, and what we need to do to make backend calls from our front-end application, and then finally setting up some routing so we can have a domain name and some certification so we can have, instead of plain old HTTP, that little S at the end stands for secure, which actually means some encryption, which requires what's called a certificate. And we'll see how to do that with Certbot. So we're going to cover a lot of ground today. I'll make sure to take a lot of breaks, and we'll kind of dig into each of these more as we go. And then later on, I believe next week, we'll learn about this other technology, Docker, that we can use that none of these steps go away, but it makes doing it multiple times easier. So this is sort of the under the hood approach a little bit that's still really valuable and important. So I just want to check in to see if folks have any questions before we dive in. Cool. All right. And I'm actually going to pour myself a little coffee, and then we are going to dive in. So let's talk a little bit about how we've been deploying our apps until now. Can people read the text here, or is it a little hard to see?
It's a little small, Adam.
Okay, I'll do some zooming in. So big picture, all of our development has been happening on our own machine, right? On one laptop, right? Django, Postgres, all those things, and I'll pull Postgres and we'll put it over there, all happening on one laptop, including the browser. And that's going to be one of the big changes because, now we'll actually be running Django and Nginx and Postgres on a different machine than our browser. And so, up until now, the Vite Dev server that runs when we run npm dev has been our front end server. When I type in the URL that the Vite Dev server is listening for, the URL and the port, right, which is localhost for my own machine, port 5173, my browser makes a GET request to the Vite Dev server to get index.html. And then the Vite Dev server sends back index.html. The browser looks at that and it says, oh, I need a JS file that has all the React code and a CSS file that has all the CSS. And if there's any image assets, it grabs all of those. And Vite Dev server has been doing all of that work. And then in our browser, we then have our React application running in the browser. And we learned about local storage yesterday. And we're not going to, that's a little too nitty gritty. This is a bit more of a high level overview. Once our React.js app is running, it makes a bunch of HTTP requests to our Django server, which then also, talks to Postgres. And here's just an example of a post request to, say, create a user account. And that's been the flow thus far. And some of those things will stay the same, and some of them will change when we deploy onto AWS. So the biggest difference here is that it's two machines now. The React app is running in the browser on my laptop over here. But we have a virtual Linux machine running on Amazon Web Services on Amazon's cloud that's going to have our Django program, that's going to have Postgres, and that's going to have, and let me take advantage of the annotation tool. That's going to have Django and Postgres and Nginx, which is going to replace Vite Dev Server. In a real production environment, these might, in fact, even live on different virtual machines in the cloud, but that's just adds an extra level of complication for now for getting started. So a lot of the work that was happening on our own dev machine, on our own computer, is now going to be happening on this virtual Linux machine. So we're going to create a virtual Linux machine on AWS. We're going to install Postgres on it. We're going to clone our code with our repo and run all the pip install commands we need for Django. We're going to introduce a piece of software called Gunicorn that helps Django handle lots of requests happening at the same time that is necessary for deploying to a production environment. And we'll talk about that more when we get there. And we will be using Nginx, and we'll have the built JavaScript and CSS and everything in here ready to go. So we won't be running npm run dev. This replaces the Vite Dev Server. And so now on my computer, when I go to mysite.com, we're going to talk to the Nginx server to get index.html, which will send back index.html, and then the browser will request the JavaScript for our React app and CSS and so on. And then our React app makes a bunch of API requests to Django on the Linux VM in the cloud. So I just want to check in and see if folks have any questions around this. And actually, let me grab, my apologies about that. I just needed to shift Slack over to my other set of windows. So I just kind of want to pause and see if folks have any questions, sort of like big picture around this architecture. Okay, cool. Let me go ahead and break down what happens with a deployed site on the internet, because there are a lot of pieces. So there's going to be a little upfront talking, and then we'll dive into actually writing the code and building. And feel free to ask questions along the way. I'll pause for questions and look at the questions channel, but this is a good one to ask questions as we go. So, when I type codeplatoon.org into the browser, codeplatoon.org is a domain name. And so we need to have some sort of domain name registration service if we want something that's not an IP address. So we need domain name registration, domain name service, DNS, to translate a domain name or host name into an IP address. And we use AWS Route53 will do this for us. And that's what we'll be using to solve that piece of the puzzle. This S, as I mentioned in HTTPS, actually is really important. It stands for secure. And on the modern web, any website that is pretty much anything uses encryption when sending information back and forth. And that's a big part of why it's safe to like enter your credit card information and various things online, because those sites are HTTPS and those So all that traffic is encrypted, which still doesn't mean, you probably still don't want to send it in plain text to have like extra layers of security. And I actually did not expect HTTP code platoon to work. Let's see if Wikipedia works with HTTP. So these do work with HTTP. In fact, it may be like translating that to HTTPS for me. In fact, it did. That's how serious modern browsers have gotten about security. Let's see if, yeah. So I don't even know off the top of my head what hoop I have to jump through to load an HTTP site, but you've all seen that warning that says, "Hey, this connection is not secure." So in order to have an HTTPS secure connection, which is really useful, we need what's called a certificate, and that enables the HTTPS encryption. And to do that, we are going to use a tool called Certbot. So we need a certificate for a secure HTTPS connection, and we'll do that with Certbot. We obviously need somewhere. We need a server to host both our Django API, our front end server, and our database. All these will be hosted on an AWS EC2 instance, which is a Linux virtual machine. And we need just one or two more things to have all the pieces we need for production. We can't use Vite Dev Server. Vite Dev Server does a couple things that are really nice. Hot module reloading, right? When you change the code, the page refreshes, you get nice error messages, but we don't want any of that in a production environment. And Vite Dev Server wasn't really designed to be used in a production environment, so there's some other things as well. So we need a front end server to host our React app. And we're going to use this server program called Nginx that's extremely popular for that. And then we also need Django to be able to handle multiple concurrent requests, because we haven't really encountered this, but like in Python, if I make an HTTP request, it's called a blocking operation. Unlike JavaScript, like the program doesn't just keep running and wait till and then the HTTP response comes back. The Python runtime actually waits and doesn't move on to the next line until we get an HTTP response back. Like these days, modern computers are very fast. So Django and Python are both pretty fast. And all this probably happens within milliseconds. But if, say, we have like hundreds to thousands of users per day, or just bad luck and two people making requests to the Django server at the exact same time, our Django server might drop a request. So that's what Gunicorn does. It lets us actually run multiple instances of the same Django server, or what's called multiple processes. So we need our Django's API to be able to handle concurrent requests. And we're going to do that with Gunicorn. So to pop back to our diagram real quick, and let me zoom out a bit. And I think what I'll do is I'm not even going to try to add more stuff in here because there's already enough. But to sum this up, AWS Route53 is what's going to be translating this domain name into an IP address so that AWS knows what virtual server to send it to. And we're going to have an SSL certificate, and that's the S in HTTPS secure that we got through Certbot that will ensure a secure connection. Nginx is serving our React application. And then the React application talks to our Django API, which is sort of powered by Gunicorn. And so Django is sort of running inside of Gunicorn. You can think about it. So we can have like, it will automatically handle like creating multiple instances of Django if we need it, so that there can be lots of concurrent requests happening. And then of course, Django is talking to Postgres. So I do want to pause and check in here and see what questions folks have. So I know that was a lot of information. Will, yes, sir.
So does Nginx serve as the web server and the load balancer?
Great question. There is actually not a load balancer in this setup. So if we had a load balancer, and we would have to think about if the load balancer was for our front end server or our back end server, it would be like, say, another server right here, and we might have like 2 instances of our front end Nginx server, and the load balancer would distribute traffic between them. AWS has something called Route53 that does that. Or I'm so sorry, Elastic Load Balancer, I think it's called. And or if we needed a load balancer, in some ways, Gunicorn sort of is a load balancer, but not really. Or really what it would be is we would have like multiple EC2s and with a load balancer between them. But that's like if you start getting a lot more traffic on your site. Like this can actually could definitely handle like hundreds of requests, like hundreds of visitors a minute. It might be able to handle in the thousands depending on what's going on. So this can actually handle a decent amount. And Nginx is our front end server. Absolutely. Yeah, great question. Does that help answer your question a bit?
Yeah, it does. Definitely. Thanks.
Awesome. DJ, and I see you mentioned that DNS is for static IP addresses. Yeah, that's a good point. I'm honestly a little rusty on my networking, but part of what happens is when we create this EC2, I believe that AWS assigns an IP address to it that stays fixed, that stays static. Okay, awesome. Let's go ahead and let's start building some of this stuff. So let me go ahead and I am going to clone the project from yesterday. So let me dive in there real quick and grab it. And in fact, I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to fork it. And grab all the branches because there were a couple different branches. So you all might want to do, when you're doing this, the git clone, like change the remote URL thing so that the fork isn't connected. But for learning purposes, that doesn't really matter. And I just want to get this set up quickly. And I'm going to go ahead and clone this. And let me go ahead and make sure I'm in the right spot. And I believe it is the ready for deployment branch. So I think fetch should get all the different branches ready to deploy. And I do have to do a little setup work here. I apologize just to get the app spun up. So let me do this quickly. And just run npm install for our front end. And for our backend, create the virtual environment that I want. Activate it. Make sure I'm not going to check the virtual environment version control. I think I do need a requirements txt, so I think I'm going to grab it from yesterday's lesson, if I remember correctly. And let me quickly take care of that. Oh, interesting. That should have been there. I'm not sure how that happened. But let's go ahead and install. We know we need Django. And while I'm doing this, I am going to go and steal requirements.txt from one of our other lessons. And then the last thing we will need to install that we learned about yesterday is that Django cores requirement, which I can never quite remember the name of the package, Django cores headers. And it looks like it's already satisfied, and we'll do pip freeze so that requirements.txt is updated. And we should be good to go. And I am going to make sure before I start building this stuff that this application is running. I don't want to have to debug something on the Linux VM in the cloud. Okay, and now I should have, and sorry about that, but I now should have my front end server running. And the backend Django server running. And if I go to localhost 5173, interesting. I must have a Pokédex app running somewhere in the background. And indeed, if I look here, I've got localhost 5174. Let me go ahead and kill that in my other terminal and just restart this one again, just for simplicity. And now I've got my list page. In fact, I'm probably still logged in because there's still the token in local storage from the lesson yesterday. And I can go ahead and here's my list, and let's add another list just for fun, just to make sure that stuff is working. Awesome. So I've got everything up and running. Now let's start tackling the configuration stuff that we need to be able to deploy this onto AWS. And we're not going to need to worry about this stuff so much, so I'll put that off to the side. And the first thing we're going to need to change is some changes to our Django code. We're going to need to make sure that the Django secret key is an environment is in our .env file. In fact, we need to make sure that any sort of keys or tokens are in the API file. We're going to need to set debug to false. We're going to need to set Django's allowed hosts. And this debug setting, by the way, is what like when you get those nice Django error messages in the browser, that's because debug mode is set to true, and it does other things as well, but we obviously don't want that for a production environment. And I do apologize. I am in the wrong folder, so I think I'll just open up another terminal window here. And what I want to look at here is in the project directory, settings py. So this Django secret key now needs to live in an environment variable in a .env file, which should be here in my backend directory. And we never want to check that .env file into version control. So I am going to go ahead and make a ignore file here as well. And I'm going to add .env to it. And I am going to go ahead and now create that .env directory. And I'm just going to copy this secret key here into the .env file. And then in settings.py, we do need to change this now so it grabs it from the environment, which we can do with that .env library that we have. So I can do os.environ.get and then secret key. As the comment here points out, debug needs to be set to false. Django's allowed hosts is the hosts that the Django API allows to access it, which is a bit different from the core setting, though it does have some similarity, but this is about any requests at all, not specifically cross-origin ones. And like someone was asking about the Pokemon API yesterday, it's a good example of, for a public API, you would want allowed hosts to be probably true for everything. And any extra security that you needed around that, like I was mentioning for like IP addresses of like known malicious actors, would probably be handled with a different server actually put in front of the Django server. And also for simplicity for deployment, we're just going to use the star wildcard so that our API can receive requests from any hosts. And we also need this cores allow all origins to be set to true so that we can receive any and all cross-origin requests. Eventually, we would probably want to change this to use that that cores list of like only maybe allowing cross-origin requests from our Nginx server, but we don't know what that IP address is yet, and that's a change we could make later once the app is live and deployed into production. So I just want to pause and check in and see if folks have any questions around these steps, because the config changes, right? There's not a lot of code to change, but it's more kind of understanding each of those pieces. And Saul, yes, sir.
Yeah, just a quick question. You placed your secret key inside of your .env environment. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
Okay, just want to make sure. Thank you.
Yep, totally. And I believe I probably need to import that because OS is one of the Python standard libraries. So let's go ahead and import OS. And I actually could use some help if someone can remind me with the python.env library. I feel like there might be an extra step we need to do to grab the secret key from the .env file, because this is actually just looking in the shell environment. Adrian, yes, sir.
I think you had to import the .env library, and then you had to make like an alias or a variable that you use to call it.
Yeah, and Will, I see you sharing some relevant code in there as well. Yeah, I believe that is the case. And I see a couple other hands up as well. Landon, yes, sir.
You can try just os.get env without the get at the end. I can paste it into.
Sure. Yeah, that'd be awesome. Yeah, I am pretty sure that that is a change that we need to make. I'm actually not familiar off the top of my head with os.getEnv. Do you know, Landon, is that using the Django like .env library, or is that grabbing like a shell, an environment variable from the shell environment?
I used what we had done in class, the .env one that we had to import before, and then I saw things that were utilizing the OS, and that seemed to work just fine. I can see if I can paste the comments from that operation.
Landon, really quick, did you have to export that variable first? Because that's what it looks
Yeah,
like from traditional Linux shell. You'd have to actually
yeah,
export the variable.
yeah. I think maybe we'll circle back to it later, but for now, just because this is the method I'm a bit more familiar with, to be honest, I'm just gonna go with the one that we've seen in class where .env values grabs what's in this .env file and turns it into a dictionary, I believe, and then we can just do env.get for the secret key. And in fact, if we want to, we could even add debug equals, we could even add it debug false here if we wanted to, and this is common for production deploys. I'm honestly not 100%. I think this will work without a quote, but I'm not sure if that needs to be a string or we need to turn it into a Boolean, so I'm not going to mess with it at the moment. But almost all this stuff, actually, you would put in your .env file. And do folks have any other questions before we keep on rolling around the changes that we made to our Django settings PY? And let me check actually our questions channel. Okay, awesome. So I've done that. Let me go ahead. Let me do a sanity check. Let me run the server again. Make sure I don't have any errors. If I refresh it over here, everything seems to work. So we're good to go. Oh, and I see a couple hands up. Sorry. Landon and DJ, did you guys have questions? Or those are residual
Sorry,
hands?
I was actually curious, what happens if we don't supply the secret key into Django? What error? I don't think I've ever seen that error or whatnot.
I don't remember exactly what error it throws, but Django definitely complains. It uses it for a bunch of stuff. Off the top of my head, making hashes, that's the big one. Like, say, for hashing passwords. That I think is actually the salt that it uses for hashing passwords. But that's a little outside of scope to get into it. But it's used for hashing passwords, and so Django will complain if it's not there. And in fact, the secret key value that we have, the fact that it starts with Django insecure tells us that this was a real production deploy. There's like a command line command you can use to generate a proper secret key, but this is perfectly fine for our purposes. And we can go ahead actually, and we can let's try debug equals false. And over here in settings py, let's see if we can do env.get debug. And let's see if that works. And my app still seems to be running. And if I go to lists, it gets the lists, and I can log out. And these are still the accounts that I made yesterday, since they're still in the database, which is great. Interesting.
You're missing the .com on that email.
Oh yeah, that would do it. Thank you so much. And I can log in. Perfect. So we could move the debug setting into our environment variable as well with just debug equals false, and that seems to work fine. Saul, yes, sir.
Yeah, sorry, I think I might have missed it. How did you import the .env file over to your settings?
Yeah.
That right there.
Yeah, exactly. We're using the .env library. This .env values method grabs the file and turns it into a dictionary.
Perfect. Thank you very much.
Absolutely. Yeah, thank you for asking. Awesome. So we've covered a lot of ground here. We've covered our setup steps. Up next, and then after this might be a good time for a break, is we actually have to dive into some AWS stuff. We're going to need to create our little virtual machine on AWS and connect to it with SSH, and there's a couple steps involved with that. So I went ahead, I already kind of created an AWS account for myself. It's pretty straightforward to do. It will ask for your credit card. It will not cost you any money to do any of this stuff at all. And in fact, it then asks you, do you want to be on like there's a very generous, like, sort of free tier, and you should choose the free tier option when you're prompted for it. AWS will ask you for like your phone number and your address and stuff like that. And it actually does sort of make sense for something like this, because this is actually hosting servers and stuff. And then what we're looking at here is what's called the AWS console. So those of you in DevOps will spend way more time with this than you ever wanted to. And so to create an AWS account, which I highly recommend doing, not right now because it'll take a couple steps, but just search for AWS account. You would go to create an AWS account and go for their free trial. I don't even think I did all this stuff, to be honest. I don't even think I got like all those tiers. And I think probably this, just their instructions here on how to an AWS account is the way to go. So I'll just throw this into our Zoom chat. If someone could cross post that in the resources channel, that would be awesome. So there's a couple steps here, but you end up creating an account. You won't have to spend any money. Everything we're going to do will fall under the very generous free tier that we have. And then this is what's called the AWS console, as in sort of like the command center for my AWS account, where I can create all of these different services. Somewhere in here is Route53. right, which we'll learn about to set up some domain names for our IP address for our server. But the EC2 compute is the one that we care about and the one that we want to start with. So somewhere hiding in here, and it's down here, launch a virtual machine with EC2. This is what you want to click on. If you also just search for EC2, in some ways that makes it easier, because frankly, this user interface is kind of notoriously a pain. But the end goal is we're going to create a virtual server, which EC stands for Elastic Compute, so which Amazon calls an EC2 instance. And I'm just going to name this deployment lesson, just so my server has a name. We can choose what flavor of Linux we're using. I do suggest, well, most of the time you actually want to use the Amazon sort of version of Linux. We're going to use Ubuntu for simplicity. And note that it says free tier eligible here. How's the font size on this, by the way? Can everyone see this, or should I bump it up a notch? Cool. And we have step-by-step instructions for this in the lesson for today. And we pretty much want to leave all this stuff as is. And we're going to instance type basically determines like the power of the CPU for our virtual machine, how much memory our virtual machine has. And we want to go for the cheapest free tier, this one here, the T2 Micro. We don't need to go smaller to the Nano. This one's already a free tier. I don't think these ones are free tier eligible, and this is going to be more than enough for what we need to do. The most important piece that we have to do is I do have to go to security groups and do a little bit of configuration so that our server has some open ports so that we can connect to it. And I actually need to find where that is. So it's hiding here under network settings, where it says security groups. And this text is a bit hard to see, but actually describes quite well what this is. A security group is a set of firewall rules that control the traffic for your virtual machine. Add rules to allow specific traffic to reach your instance, to reach your virtual machine. So we need to allow SSH traffic, which happens on port 22, and this is already set to anywhere from any IP address, which is fine because we're going to add some, we're going to add a SSH key that we're going to use for authentication. And we then need to open up some ports for HTTP and HTTPS traffic from the internet. HTTPS traffic, I believe, is on port 443, and AWS will just take care of opening the right port here. And we'll allow HTTP traffic too to help us debug with Certbot and stuff like that. For a real production application, you probably would not want to allow HTTP traffic. But if you were, say, building a new project, you might for a while until you made sure you had like Certbot and your SSL certificate set up. So those are the three things that we gotta allow. We also then have to download what's called a PEM certificate for our SSH key. And I actually need to make sure I know where to go to find that. And I don't think it's... I think we're actually going to do that after we create the instance. But let me double check here. So we don't need to worry about any of these other settings, by the way. And I would recommend not touching them, because if you start increasing the amount of storage you have, we get up to 30 gigabytes, but it will just eat up your free tier faster. And this is more than enough storage for what we need. You don't want to touch any of this other stuff. and just leave it as is. And let me actually, here we go. So here's the bit that I need to connect to SSH. They call it a key pair, which is also called an SSH key or a PEM key. And note that it does say here, ensure you have access to the selected key pair before you launch the instance. So we do need to do this now before we create this thing. So I'm just going to give it a name so I can keep track of it. These are different kinds of encryption. We just want to stick with RSA. I'm honestly not quite positive what the differences are between these two systems, but RSA is pretty common. And then these are different key formats. .pem, I would say, is much more common, and the one that I've almost always seen with this command line tool, SSH, that we're going to be using in just a minute and learning a little bit about. And this message here is pretty important. Once we create this key, we need to keep track of it. We won't be able to come back to it here and find it later. We'd have to create a new key pair. And note that it's been downloaded into my downloads directory. And my Mac is actually prompting me. Let's see if I can get this on the screen so I can show you all. So when I clicked on it, it actually did prompt me, do you want to add a certificate from the file deployment lesson to a keychain? This doesn't really matter because in a minute we're going to put it somewhere else on the command line. But I don't think it will hurt for those of you on Mac to say yes if you see this pop up. And I guess it didn't work. That's fine. It doesn't really matter. If I open up a Finder and I go to downloads, I can see here this PEM key that's been downloaded. And normally you would never want to show this to people. But I can always generate a new one later. And I think after this lesson, I'll just delete this. So it's okay to show it to you all and have it end up on the video. So I'll just go into my downloads directory just so we can see this. And the name is deploymentlesson.pem. So let's open up deploymentlesson.pem just so you can see what this thing looks like. So again, normally, like, you never ever would want to show this in a YouTube video, but once the lesson is done, I'm just going to destroy this EC2 instance and the SH key associated with it, so it won't be an issue. So this is the private key that you always want to keep secret. There is a public key that AWS has, and with your private key, you can then authenticate against that public key and establish an encrypted connection, essentially, with this program SSH. And that lets you securely log into the Linux virtual machine in the cloud on that EC2. And you'll get a command line there, and you'll be the root user, and you can do all the normal command line things that you can do. So we'll come back to that in just a minute. And it's important not to lose track of that. So I know the name of that file, and I'm not going to lose track of it. Let's go ahead and launch our instance, though, to get this finished up. And we're not going to submit a survey. And we have successfully launched our instance. So if I now go to, I can click here. I can see details of my instance. I can see the name, the instance ID. I can see if it's running or if it's stopped. There's a lot of stuff here not worth going into. Note here is the IP address. And you do raise a good point, DJ, about the static versus dynamic IPs. Because I think if we kill and restart this, it becomes a different IP, but that's also what Route53 is for. And now I can see that the instance is running. I can see sort of all sorts of information about my instance here. And let's see if they actually, somewhere around here should be, is it under actions? So if I go to actions and connect, I believe this will actually let me connect with like a browser in the console. Here's how to do this with SSH. Let's see if we can actually make this work though. So now I'm actually inside my virtual server running in the cloud. This is the Linux command line that you all have seen before. So you can do this once you're logged into your AWS account. So you can always access it this way. How we're going to see using it with SSH does make stuff a bit easier, but I did want to just demonstrate this. And now I've logged out, and I'm going to go ahead and close that out. And AWS gives me an EC2 dashboard so I can see all the instances I have, which I have just one running, and I can stop it and I can start it. So I believe if I click on it and I go to instance state, I can stop it, I can start it, I can reboot it. Terminating will delete it, so we don't want to do that. And it's totally fine to leave it running for now. And if I go to my main AWS console dashboard, I can see here that recently visited EC2. I would have thought it actually would have popped up here. I'm not seeing it. So I think, EC2 is where we're going to want to go to manage our instance once it's created. So I know we're almost on the hour. Let me just pause and see what questions folks have. And then I think maybe after the break, we'll dive into SSH so that we can properly talk about that. So we'll look at that one after the break. So yeah, what's on people's minds? Landon, yes, sir.
Is your plan from your diagram earlier to install Postgres on that virtual machine, or are you going to utilize like Amazon's, I don't know what they call it, maybe RDS or something like that, but just curious.
Yeah, great question. They call it RDS, which stands for Relational Database Service, which you can then specify as Postgres. We're just going to install Postgres on this EC2 instance for simplicity, and also because I don't remember off the top of my head where RDS falls under the free tier. So for simplicity, we're just going to install everything on this one virtual machine. But you're absolutely correct that like for a real production environment, at some point we would probably want to use RDS or have Postgres living on its own machine.
Thank you, Adam.
Yeah, great question. Yeah, and you'd want to use RDS. Brian, yes, sir.
Sorry, sir, I was heads down when you were talking about downloading the PEM file to your local machine. After you downloaded it, are we just supposed to store it, or was there anything you had to do with it to get the instance to launch?
There's nothing you have to do to get the instance to launch, and you can manage the instance here from the AWS console, which you don't need the PEM file for. So you can always, you have to go here to sort of the EC2 page. I'll just navigate from the top real quick just so people can see it. Honestly, I just search for stuff half the time. So EC2 is where we're going to spend a lot of our time. And when I have this instance, I can stop it, I can reboot it, I can delete it if I want to. Connect, well, if you use EC2 Instance Connect, this is what opens up that like essentially shell session in your browser where I am now like connected to the server. Where I can, do whatever I want here.
I was just wondering why we need to download the
That-
file.
yeah.
Like, what do we do with it?
Yeah, what I'm going to go into after the break is, instead of connecting that way, we're going to use a program called SSH that is installed on everyone's computer because it comes with all instances of Linux everywhere. And that way, in our own terminal on our own computer, we can SSH in and connect to that machine, and we will need the PEM key for that. And I'll go over that after the break.
Thank you very much, sir.
Yeah, absolutely. Great question. As long as you don't lose the PEM key, you're good to go. Because there's just a couple of steps involved with doing that correctly. So I figured we can break and then dive into it when we're fresh. And DJ, I agree with your comment in the chat. Web-based SSH, like we were doing with the connect command here, can be a little flaky. It's much easier to do it from your own terminal. It gives you a much better workflow. What other questions do folks have related to AWS, related to EC2s, any of these steps that we went through?
I had a question. You mentioned that the T2.micro instance type was like plenty for what we're trying to do, but I was curious, like what kind of variables you were looking at to make that determination? Like when we're trying to use it in the future, like how do we know that that's plenty? You know what I mean?
Got it. Yeah, that's a good question. I would say that I think that is a bit of a bigger question. I would just start with the micro instance type for everything, to be honest, and you will be able to tell if your application is running slow. It's literally the difference between, buying a laptop with 8 gigs of RAM versus 16 gigs of RAM, or this processor versus that processor. But bear in mind that the only thing that this computer is doing is running the stuff that we put on it. So the micro will actually get you relatively far for real world traffic. And the question you're asking, I think, delves a bit into performance, because it depends like how well performing is the server application that you're running, how much load does it have, and stuff like that. So I don't know if I have a good answer to that. Because also there's like strategies with load balancing where maybe I spin up like 3 micros instead of going up to like a smaller, medium, or large. But here with the instance types, we can see what they are. So the micro has 1 gigabyte of memory. It doesn't really have any storage, which is fine. We can also see the pricing, by the way, though again, we have a free tier, so we get actually a lot of activity for pricing, and AWS prices stuff out by like fractions of a cent per hour, but I think it might actually break it down to the second. And if it's not running, we're not paying for it. But cloud stuff is notorious for becoming expensive fast. So even though these are tiny amounts, they can end up adding up. So I would recommend just starting with the micro, and you'll kind of be able to tell if the performance is low. I hope that helps a bit, Kara.
No, that makes sense. Thank you.
Yeah, totally. On a practical level, like the next thing to learn about in terms of thinking about like reliability for a deployed application is like load balancing. And that's a little bit out of scope of what we're looking at today. The other thing to remember with all this stuff is that text is really small. So like while our database has a lot of stuff in it and our code is a lot of files, I don't even know if the entire curriculum repo adds up to like more than a couple megabytes in terms of text, if that. Let's actually see how much text in a megabyte. So 1 megabyte can fit 500 pages of text. So since that's like the bulk of what the kind of programs that we're writing now are dealing with, that's not a very big issue in looking at performance. It's more about then maybe the amount of traffic that's coming to the site. And also on a practical level, like Landon was saying, like the next step is we wouldn't actually want Postgres running on the micro instance. We would use Amazon RDS, which costs a bit more, but gives more reliability and backups. But that takes all the work of Postgres off of the micro. And we wouldn't actually want the Nginx server on the same EC2 instance on this micro instance as well. We actually want to spin up like 2 micro instances, one with Nginx and one with Django. But that starts to add to a bit more complexity. But like those kinds of things would actually, I think, be the next things in terms of like making the system more production ready and robust. Okay. I realize I went on a bit of a tangent there, so thank you all for bearing with me. Why don't we take, do you all want to do like 10 or 15? 10. Let's take 10, and then we'll set up the SSH key. And we'll set up Ubuntu dependencies, and we'll dive into actually closing down the repo and setting up Nginx to serve our React application and stuff with Django. So it should be good. Thank you very much, everyone. Have a good break. Definitely get away from the screen, and see you all in 10 minutes. Okay, so we kind of walked through what we're doing, big picture. We've gone ahead and we've done most of the configuration we need to for Django. And we just walked through creating an EC2 instance on AWS. So now let's talk about connecting to EC2 with SSH. So SSH stands for Secure Shell. And it's the most common way, I would say, that devs authenticate for all sorts of connections between Linux machines. Like I use SSH authentication with GitHub, and then very much like connecting remotely to Linux box somewhere else. And the program is installed on pretty much every instance of Linux ever. And so we're going to dig into it a little bit today. We're not going to go too deep, though I was poking around a bit. So step 1 is in your home directory. If you type ls-a to see all of the different dot files and dot directories, there should be one named .ssh in there. I believe it should be created by default for everyone and exist for everyone. And this is where we want to put our SSH key. And as you can see, I have a bunch of SSH keys from DevOps or other stuff that I was doing. I think this one is the GitHub one. Some of these might be old. So step 1 is I'm going to copy the SSH key that ended up in my downloads. And I believe it was named like deployment lesson. Yep. Right here into this .ssh directory. The next step is it's important with SSH keys to set the Linux permissions on that file, because SSH will not let you use a key that has like write access to it. For security reasons, I think it's for security reasons, we have to set it so that our SSH key is read only, like this other SSH key for DevOps. So ls-l lists files and shows the read, write, and execution permissions for users and Linux groups, which are a little out of scope for all of the files and directories here. So note for all these other SSH keys, the only permission is read. Right, well, yeah, but for this one, because I just created and I was moving it around, it has a write permission, that W on there. So we do need to change that. And I am looking up the command to do this in the notes because I always forget this. The command to change file permissions is chmod. And I honestly don't know what that stands for. Excuse me, change something. It's actually a really powerful command. There are a bunch of different ways to use it. Without going into too much detail, one of the most common ways you'll see is sort of this number system where there's 3 numbers, and I believe each number stands like for, I want to say, users and groups and something else. And DJ, you might be able to correct me because I feel like I'm missing one of the pieces here for the chmod command.
Yeah, it's user groups and others. So anybody that doesn't
Others.
have, yeah, others is
Yeah.
that's the wide open security. So you rarely ever want anything writable or executable, but for web pages, they have to be readable by others to be able to actually serve from the web server. You can do it with the 600, or you can do a dash or a minus W, and that'll take all of the write permissions off.
Ah, that's cool. Okay. So I'll run it just for consistency of what we have in the lesson doc, but I'll also type out the minus W command. So what we're going to do here is for this deployment lesson.pem, note that there's this write permission here, and we want to remove that. And so we're saying for the user that I'm not going to go into the number codes now, but essentially 600 will set it so that the user can only read this file. Though it looks like it left the right, which I don't think it should have done. So I'm going to take your advice, DJ, and we'll do chmod-w. And there we go. And now it's gone. So I'll update the curriculum doc. And in fact, I'll go ahead and I'll paste this command in the Zoom chat. And if someone could actually maybe just cross post that into Whiskey resources, that would be awesome. So now I've moved the SSH key into my .ssh directory, and I've made it read only. There's a couple other nice things that we can do with SSH to make life a little easier, but I just want to demonstrate the basic approach. And the format for using an SSH key is, so we have to run chmod w SSH key name to make the key file read only, which SSH requires. And we're going to want to copy the file into your .ssh directory. And then to actually make the SSH request, we do SSH-I the pen key with the full file name here. And then, so what this is username on remote machine at IP address. So this is the command that we're going to run in just a minute. So let's take a look at my EC2 to get that information. And I'll just type EC2 here, and we'll go back to EC2. And we've got running instances. So what I need is, I believe it is this public IP4 DNS right here, the EC2 all these identifying numbers .us east -2 .compute .amazon aws.com. I might be able to use this one as well. I think that's the IP address, and then this is the host name. I believe either will work. I'll use the IP address just to get started. And by default, the root user on this instance is named Ubuntu. And if I wanted to confirm that, I could use the connect command to do the EC2 instance connect and run that whoami command. And in fact, they have the default username defined here and written here. And actually, they give us here the full command that we want to run, which is nice to see. So you can also go to the connect and go to SSH client, and they're just using the domain name here. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. And in fact, I will just copy this whole command. So note that with this way of connecting with SSH, it does matter where I run this command from, because I need the path to this file, right? And because I'm in the SSH directory and I put the file there, I can run this command just fine. But if I was, say, in my home directory, I would need to change this to, I believe, ./.ssh/ that, or whatever the path to my SSH key file is. For simplicity, I would say, as a habit, you can just navigate into the .ssh directory and run the command there. And you will be prompted for this, and this is okay. And we're going to say yes. And what my computer is telling me is that this is a new host and a new IP address. I don't know anything about it. Are we sure we want to connect? We should only have to say yes once, and then it will save it. And so now I'm actually logged in to that Ubuntu machine. If I type who am I see Ubuntu. And in fact, there is that foo.txt file that we saw before. There are some nice things that we can do with SSH with a config file so that I don't have to type that full command out every time, but that's a little outside scope. And if someone reminds me, I'll share a resource to show that later. So I just want to check in to see what questions folks have around SSH before we dive into actually setting up the dependencies and the things that we need here. Tom, yes, sir.
A quick question. So Ubuntu, is that a user that's loaded in, or is that the root?
Great question. That is a Linux user. That's the name
Okay.
of the root user, and it just by default, I guess, has the same name as the operating system.
And so it has like a full file system above that has like the root and like user permissions and stuff.
Yeah, there's
Okay.
/home/Ubuntu. If I go to the root directory for my whole Linux machine, we've got all the things.
Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Great question. Landon, the AWS CLI, you mean through the web browser?
Yeah, there's like this tool that I used before, and I didn't know if it was just like a one-off thing, but it seemed like you could manage pushing things from your terminal if you had authenticated with like the Amazon CLI before.
I would have to, the Amazon CLI. Yes, you probably can. I don't think we're going to cover that today, but remind me and I'll share a link. That's actually a good thing to see.
Okay, thank you.
Oh, and DJ, you were saying that the Ubuntu user is actually not the true root user. You're absolutely right. That's a good point. We're privileged, so we can use sudo to be root, but we should never actually be logged in and working as root, because that's a little too powerful and it's too easy to make a mistake that would really screw something up. Oh, and DJ, that's an excellent point, that if we go to cd / what is it?
Roots will be /root right from the base, right from the absolute base. But if you're in /home, you're a user.
Got it. Okay, that's good to know. That's cool. So that the root users directory is actually here. And in fact, I'm not allowed to use it, but if I do sudo cd root, did it let me do it? Yeah, well, that's something to explore for another day. We've got privileged access, which is enough that we need to go and do what we need to do. And let's see. Oh, I could do sudo.
You might
Yeah.
have to try the super user command, the SU.
Oh, thank you. And I have no idea what that password is. I just hit enter. Yeah, I'm not going to worry about that now. I'm getting a little off track. But it is interesting to see, and that's good to know that we're an admin user and not the proper root. So we have a couple of things we have to do now to
Hey,
set this Ubuntu
Adam?
instance up. Oh, yes.
Sorry, there was a question in the.
Oh, thank you so much. Yeah, let me catch up on Whiskey questions.
Yeah, it's me. So our .ssh should be in our home directory, right?
That is correct.
What happens if we don't see one?
Did you run ls-a?
I did, yes.
I am not sure off the top of my head, to be honest, if it's not there. For now, what I would recommend is you can just put the PEM key in your home directory, just so you don't lose track of it. And then you should be able to do all the other commands just fine in terms of using chmod to change the file permission and running the SSH command to connect to the EC2. And Crystal, thank you for asking, and Kara, thank you for the reminder. I apologize that I missed that. Yeah, I think the cause of a missing .ssh directory is a bit of a bigger thing that I'm honestly not sure about. So I think as long as you can SSH in to the EC2, then you're fine, and figuring that out is worth doing, but not a blocker. Other questions around SSH before we start installing dependencies? Cool. And Crystal, I might follow up with you after lunch just to check in. Because ideally we'll get that set up, but I don't think that would be like a one-step process. So we've got a bunch of things that we need to install on Ubuntu here. Because we're using Linux, the package manager is named apt. So the first thing I'm going to do is update the package manager to get updated versions of where to go to get packages and updating the package manager itself. And then we need to install basically all the things that we kind of installed on day one install fest. We're going to have to install Python 3 and pip. We're going to have to install Postgres. We're going to have to create a Postgres user. There's a Postgres library, Nginx. So there's a number of things. So I'm just going to kind of start running them because it'll take a minute and talking through it as we go. And sudo lets us run a command as the root user, which we do have to do, I believe, when installing stuff with the apt package manager. So let's install pip for Python 3. And this will take a minute. So while this stuff is running, I'll just kind of talk through these steps. So the Nginx web server we need. Oh, let's see what's going on here. And one moment, so I am honestly not sure what this is, which services should be restarted. I am just going to hit OK. So the golden rule with sort of system config stuff is when in doubt, just accept whatever the default is and don't touch anything. And probably more than half the time that will take care of what's needed. And now that that's installed, I'm going to go ahead and install Postgres. And Saul, yes, sir. What's up?
Yeah, apt is a package manager, if I have that correct. And then we also have brew. Could we use brew?
No, I wouldn't, because brew is really meant for Mac. I know it exists and it's out there for Linux. Apt is sort of like the standard Linux package manager. So unless there's a specific reason why apt is not working, I would recommend apt. Plus, all of our curriculum docs are using apt as well. So that way you're just on the same path as everyone else.
And that's just for the SSH, right?
That is for the Linux virtual machine that you have SSH'd into, yes.
Oh, okay, sounds good. Thank you.
Yeah. In general, I would say if you're in like a proper Linux distro that's not Mac OS X, you probably want to use apt as your package manager. Landon, yes, sir.
I guess my kind of question revolves around all these installations that we're putting on the VM. Like in the past, I've seen things where like NPM version have like collided when trying to like run something on, like if you're hosting an instance on Amazon before. Is there a way to specify like a requirements txt for the version of Python that you're installing, the version of Postgres and all that, so that it's all the same, like every time, like if you wanted to respin this thing up and you've done all this work, is there a way to specify specific versions? And
There is, we will learn about that more when we get into Docker next week, though.
okay, all right, thank you.
Yeah, the answer to your question is Docker. That's really the modern way to do that, is use a Docker container, and then you have the exact image that you built. And you're absolutely right that that is an important concern. Let me go ahead and figure out what the issue is I ran into here with creating this Postgres user. Let's see. Service it restarts being deferred. So I might. Let's see if that password works. So let's do a quick Google search actually and find out AWS Ubuntu user password, because we might need a default password. Maybe it is Ubuntu. Or let's see if maybe we can set the password. Okay, so I just set my password to password. Let me go ahead. I'll add this to set Ubuntu user password into our notes. And I think that will do what we need, but let's see if that does it. So let me circle back to our Postgres create user command and try this one more time. Sudo u Postgres.
You're
create
logged in
user.
as root.
Oh yeah, thank you. Create user, super user, user. could not change the directory, home Ubuntu, permission denied, role Ubuntu already exists. Let's see about SU Postgres, and let's try the password that I just created.
Postgres by default doesn't have a password. You don't really want to set Postgres's password, but if you super user into root, you can execute commands as Postgres by doing that same thing, but you want a super user first.
I was hoping that whatever password I'm being prompted for when I need this SU command would work.
Yeah, if I remember right from when I did the research for my system, Postgres is not actually allowed to log into the system.
Yeah.
And so when you change it to be able to log in, you just compromise some of the security. And that was where I was having to use the super user command and then execute commands as Postgres when we were doing the install fest.
Okay, and now I wonder if I've gotten myself into trouble because I can't seem to SU as root anymore.
Also, during my install fest, I had used special characters for the password, and it turned out it didn't give me an error, but it also doesn't allow that.
Right, that makes sense, that we wouldn't want that for the password. Let's see if I can't. I will circle back to that one. We will need to get that set up, but let me at least install these other things. And just sort of running through this list of stuff. And so, yeah, folks, when you run into these sort of which services should be restarted, just don't, I would say, don't touch anything and hit enter. We can always stop and restart the whole EC2 instance at some point if we need to. Let's see if I can figure out why my authentication failure is failing with the super user, because I do feel like this is causing a bit of potentially a problem. Okay, so that seems to work. I'm not sure why that didn't work the other way, but
You had a dash in there. I don't know what the dash means after the SU.
oh,
Yeah, that might have been something different.
the issue that I'm running into is I don't know what password to type here when I get password prompted with SU.
That's interesting that the sudo SU works, but the regular SU doesn't. That's kind of weird.
Yeah, I agree. I will circle back to that, but for the moment, at least, let me throw this in our notes file so that we make sure that I'm just documenting any extra steps. I even set a password. Though
Whose
I'm not sure if
password did you set? Because if
I-
you did password Ubuntu, that set Ubuntu's password.
Yes, I set the password for the Ubuntu user, which maybe.
Because if you do password by itself, you should be able to set root's password.
Got it. Yeah, I think I'm not even going to worry about that, because if sudo su gets me root, then I think that's half the battle that I need. Let's see if I can run this command now to create the Postgres user that I need as so if I just log in with psql, fatal role root does not exist. Psql, what is it? Let's see, how do we psql log in as user? So I need a bit of a reminder. So psql -d. So this is the command.
Yeah, that command right there is how you change to execute a command as Postgres, by the way it looks, the sudo -u.
Yeah, so that's the one that should be working, but let's try super user Ubuntu. And again, the issue I'm running into is two things: could not change directory to home Ubuntu, creation of new role failed, permission already denied. So let's piece.
Did it automatically create the user inside Postgres?
That is a good question. I actually had not thought about that.
So that's just missing the database, right?
There we go. I think you may, I didn't even think about that. It
So it's
looks
a
like it
recent,
did.
it's
Okay.
or relatively recent, as far as I understand, when I was doing the research, when you're installing the package, part of the package install script is creating the user of the, who installs it, if I remember right.
I actually did not know that. That's great. That actually makes our lives a lot easier because we can change this Postgres command to, and let me go ahead and document this right now. Postgres setup after install. And we'll put this here. And I don't think we even need this password stuff. We can just run psql, and then we can do create psql-d Postgres, since the Ubuntu user exists, but Ubuntu user database does not. And we'll create a database named Ubuntu just to make psql easier to use. And a Postgres user named Ubuntu automatically gets created with all the permissions we need. So folks, my apologies for this divergence. I think we do have it sorted out though. It turns out that when we installed Postgres, it created an Ubuntu user that has all of the permissions we need. It's a super user, can create a role, can create a database. And I'm just going to create a database named Ubuntu, just so when I want to pSQL, it's easy and I just have to do that. So sorry for the digression there. I think we are back on track though. And I believe I installed this library already, but I'll just run the command again because it won't hurt. And it's already installed. And let's install Nginx if we haven't. And so those are our core dependencies. And now we're getting into stuff specific to our actual Django application for requirements.txt, creating a database with the name that we need, running migrations. So these things actually I will hold off on. And I think, oh, I see. Yeah, I'm going to go ahead and clone the repo. Though actually, what I do need to do before cloning the repo is these changes that I made to it way back at the beginning of the lesson, and not the stuff in all these PyCache directories, which is a bit of a pain, but the other files like settings py, I think was really the only one that changed. All this other stuff is PyCache stuff that we actually need to add a git ignore for. I do need to add that. So let me go ahead and I think what I'll do is I'll make a new branch and we'll call it deployment lesson just in case. And we'll do git add to do project settings py. Make changes to Django settings for deploying on AWS. And I think what I'll also do is I'll copy this env file into an env.example file. And I'm going to remove the actual secret key there, and add the env example file as sort of documentation of what's needed. I'm going to push these changes. So I do apologize. I should have actually pushed those changes just when we were doing them way back in the beginning of class. But to circle back, here is the repo that I forked. And for all of you that you would maybe clone the same way that you were doing assignments from that deployment app. And I made a branch named deployment lesson, and this is the branch that I'm going to use. You could make a branch named production or whatever you want. And I can see right here is the commit with the changes that we made to our Django settings PY. Just to recap, with the getting our env stuff from our env file and changing this allowed host setting. So now that I've pushed those changes to my GitHub repo, and I hopped over to, and I'll rename this to Adam's local machine, just to help keep be able to keep track of stuff. And then here's where we're SSH'd into AWS, where it says ssh.ssh. So I'm in the home directory of this Ubuntu server, and I'm just going to clone my whole repo with the project that I want. And I actually may need to, so I do have to make a choice here, because right now I believe this repo is private. And indeed, we got this error, fatal, could not read from remote repository. So if I want to, I can use a command called scp to copy my GitHub key over here. I think what I'm going to do for the purposes of simplicity is I can just make this repo public, and then I can clone this down just fine. And I think that's what I'm going to do just to keep the ball rolling. Though we'll see if this lets me make it public or not, because I did fork. So let's actually take a short detour into SCP. And I do need a quick reminder to how to do this, to be honest. And I do believe, yes, so the scp command is going to be very similar to the ssh command. So I'm going to go to, let's see if making the repo public works, because then actually that we can, yeah, I can't do it because I forked. If you clone, you can change the repo visibility to public, and then that will work fine. Alternatively, here's how to use scp to copy an ssh key. And I am sort of looking at this as my guide to make sure that I do this right. And I think what I'm also going to do is go to my GitHub real quick to double check that I know which SSH key I indeed want to copy. And so if I go over here to SSH and GPG keys, I see code Platoon Mac, da 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 da. I suppose the other way is I could actually create a new SSH key if I wanted to. And GitHub will actually want me to authenticate. So let me go ahead and do that real quick with the mobile app. You must, oh, interesting. Okay, we'll just copy the key. And honestly, that will be good to see. My apologies for jumping around a bit. So Platoon Mac, SHA-256, blah, 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 blah. So what I'm going to do is on my own machine, I'm going to navigate to my SSH directory. And I am pretty sure that this is my GitHub public key. I'm pretty darn sure about that. So we are going to run this scp command that is going to copy the key onto the other server. So I need a couple things here. SCP, and then I actually need to give it first the key that lets me connect to the EC2 instance, deployment lesson.pem. And then I need to give it the file that I want to copy, which is this other key, ID underscore ED255 19 .pub, I think. Though it could, let me make sure I know which key I need to copy here. Okay, so it's actually the other one that does not end in PEM, this one right here. And I will probably have to actually regenerate that key after the lesson, which is fine. So we're going to do scp-i deployment lesson.pem, and then my GitHub private key that I want to copy over, and then Ubuntu at, and here I am going to hop back over to AWS to grab the right host name that I want to use to SSH in. So EC2 dash all of this good stuff. And then a colon, and then where I want this file to live and what I want its name to be. And I'm just going to do colon slash home slash Ubuntu. And I'm just going to leave the name the same. And so now, fingers crossed, that has been copied over here. And indeed, there is that key. So I do need to change the file permissions on that key now. And I'm going to use the command DJ suggested shaman-w. So now let's see if that git clone command works for me. Permission denied, public key. Maybe it is the public key that I have to copy over. And it might help if I put these keys in the SSH directory, actually. And now let's try this git clone command and see if it works. There should not be a passphrase. So I do apologize, folks, and I also realize I've been spinning my wheels here a bit. So I think let's take a 5-minute break. Let me sort this out. That way we can all get away from the screen and I can focus on this and get this sorted, and then we can continue on with our install, because this one is a bit of a blocker. So I do apologize that I went in circles a bit figuring this one out. Just to recap before we break, we've installed really all the big dependencies that we need. And I now want to clone down that repo. And then we're going to do things like installing Django requirements, creating a Postgres database, and everything else. And then after that, I think what we'll focus on is configuring the Nginx server, because this is probably the newest thing that takes the most work. And that will be good to dig into. And then the last bit here with Gunicorn and Nginx, this stuff is a little less interesting and a little more just about config steps. So I do apologize about the delay. Let's take 5. I'll sort this out and then we'll keep on rolling. All right, so I ended up being able to generate a new SSH key and adding it to my GitHub account, and my clone worked, and I've got the deployment app here. So I do apologize about that. I went down a bit of a rabbit hole. Long story short, what might be easiest and is probably good learning anyway is just on the EC2 instance, follow these commands to create a new SSH key, and then follow these commands from GitHub to add that SSH key to your GitHub account. And then you'll have another GitHub SSH key that is really, you can use it just for like this AWS stuff. And I did share both of these links in Whiskey resources, and they're also, you can find them in the GitHub docs. I'm pretty sure the SCP worked fine. And then the step that I actually forgot was there's a SSH add command in here. I'm pretty sure that was the step I forgot to add the key itself. But it's not working. And again, making the repo public will make this issue go away. So let's pick up where we left off, just with installing dependencies. Now that I have my project on my AWS EC2 instance, I can start doing all the things that we need to, like installing requirements.txt. And if I go into my backend code, and in fact, we don't have the requirements.txt, but I remember making it over here. So let's go to, where did I clone that repo? Here we go. So let's go into the backend directory. Let's add requirements.txt. Let me run pip freeze to make sure that it's all up to date. Actually, I should probably do pip freeze and pipe it into requirements.txt. And now let's add requirements.txt and let's commit it. And this is actually a good example of the workflow of if you do write code and then you want to get it onto your AWS server, this is how you would do it. You write the code, you commit it, you push it. It's now up on GitHub, right? And as long as I'm pulling down the same branch, and so let's check out, I believe the branch name here is deployment lesson. So over here, let's check out the deployments. Branch. And let's do a git pull. And now I've got that requirements.txt. And now I can run pip install. And because this is the only Python program that's going to be running on here, I don't need to worry about a virtual environment. And now we're going to want to create a database. And let me do a quick sanity check as to the database name to make sure I get it right. And it is indeed to-do underscore db. So let's run the create db command to-do underscore db. And now I've got my database. And now let's run migrations. I always run the make migrations command just to be safe. And I do need to use the Python 3 command here because we haven't created an alias to Python 3, which is something that we could do if you wanted to look back from day one install fest. You could add that to like your bash profile here. And now let's go ahead and migrate and apply all those migrations to our database. And now let's hop into the front end. And we do have to install npm because it's not installed by default on this machine. And this will take just a minute, but we should be done soon. And once npm is installed, we're going to install the N version manager, which is how we'll install versions of Node and install our front end dependencies. And then we'll take a look at Nginx. And I think this will sort of be our focus for the rest of the lesson, because I realize it's been a long morning. And thank you all for being patient. So npm is almost done installing. And again, just hit enter for these commands. And now that npm is installed, let's use it to globally install the N version manager for Node.js. And now let's use N to get the latest stable version of Node, which is version 20.12. And so now we should have Node.js installed. And now I should be able to run npm install to install all of my different dependencies. And this command, npm run build, is actually the most important command that we're going to run. This is in our package.json. And I think I'll just open it up here in Vim so we can see it real quick. So remember, we have these scripts. And we've been doing npm run dev that runs the Vite dev server. And what the Vite dev server actually does under the hood is also run this build command. And this actually generates the JavaScript files and bundles up all the CSS and everything that gets sent over to the browser. So this is actually a really important command. And note that it says Vite building for production. And it all goes in a directory named dist, which is short for distribution. And if we go in here and we take a look, we'll see a lot that looks similar. Here's the index.html. Note that these JavaScript files have this weird name because this JavaScript file has actually been generated from our source code. Same with this CSS file that's actually been generated from our source code. And so all of the code for our React app is now in this directory named assets. And all the JavaScript like function names and variable names have been renamed to be something shorter. The JSX was actually turned into normal JavaScript. And it's called like minifying and transpiling the JavaScript. And it's not really meant to be human readable. But just so to show, this is actually our whole React JavaScript app, made as small as possible, and all the JSX turned into normal JavaScript so the browser can understand it. And so all this stuff in here is actually what our Nginx server is going to serve. So I do apologize that I got a little stuck in the weeds with SSH there. So I think I do want to move on to Nginx, and then I'll pause and check in on questions once we dig more into that. So Nginx is now going to be the server for our React app. Nginx is extremely popular. It gets used as a load balancer. It gets used for all sorts of server applications. It's flexible and it's fast. And this is sort of a new world for us. And I'm just going to make this terminal really big because this is where we're going to be living for the next couple minutes. And now there are ways, and we'll learn this later, just to do this Nginx configuration on your local machine in VS Code. You could install Nginx and add these Nginx config files to your GitHub repository. It adds a couple extra steps. So we are just going to do this on the AWS instance, though if you were doing more work, you probably would not want to. So we are going to use this Vim program. You could also use this program Nano. That's another command line text editor to go ahead and make these changes. And with stuff like Nginx configs, you really don't want to touch or change this unless you know what you're doing and you're sure why. So this is sort of a type exactly or copy and paste situation. So when we installed Nginx, its configuration was stored in this directory /etc/Nginx. So let's go over there. And if we take a look, we indeed do see this config.d file and Nginx config, which is actually the one that we really care about. So this is the first file that we're going to modify for Nginx. So there are a couple steps here. So we're changing the user to the name of our Linux system user, which is Ubuntu. This next line is unchanged, this line is unchanged, and this line is unchanged. All of this other stuff we are really leaving as is. And again, the rule is unless you're specifically told to add something or delete something, not to touch it. So like all of these basic settings, I'm not touching. And you can see here, these are the basic settings for handling HTTP requests. The event stuff is a little out of scope, and that the format of this Nginx config file is you sort of have this keyword, and then in between these curly brackets, all sorts of configuration information for all sorts of different things, for compression, for SSL, and so on. So the next step that needs to happen is with Nginx, there's this sites enabled directory, and that's what Nginx is actively using. So we do need to go look at that. And look at this default config. And here we can see some things that look a little more familiar, like what port the Nginx server is listening on. And we're going to leave it at port 80. But we do now need to add some stuff. I believe this stuff is already there by default. I believe this stuff is there by default. And then I believe we do want to modify some of this location information, because we need to tell Nginx where to go once it gets an HTTP request to find stuff. So Nginx is going to listen on port 80 and then handle any HTTP requests by sending our React app back to the browser. So by sending back that index.html. So all of these are untouched. But over here, we are going to make some changes. So we are going to set the root to user/share/nginx HTML dist. And then let's see here. And then for try files, I think we will add /index.html as the fallback step. And so now we are telling Nginx that it's going to find our index.html from a directory that's going to be inside user share nginx HTML dist. But we actually need to change this. So the easiest thing to do is, yeah, this is definitely the way to go. We are just going to copy our whole dist directory into Nginx's default right here. So the important thing here is this /dist, like user/share/nginx/html, all that already, those directories were set up by Nginx, but we've added dist for our distributed front-end code. And now I'm going to copy that code from our GitHub repo in here into the Nginx config file. So I'm going to go ahead and then over here, we tell Nginx, like when you're looking for something, where to go to find stuff and what order to do it in. So first it tries to look at the path that it gives, but then it'll go to index.html and then eventually 404. So I am going to navigate back to my home directory, I think. And if we look at deployment app lesson front end, we see dist. So I'm going to copy -r deployment app lesson front end dist to user share nginx HTML. And I need to stick a sudo in front of that. And now I'm going to actually navigate into user share nginx HTML. And I see there's a dist there. Interestingly, I see there's an nginx HTML. That one will get ignored. And here in dist, we see our code. So we've just copied our React app into the directory that Nginx is going to look to when it gets a request to serve a file, when it gets a request from the browser. So let's go ahead and restart Nginx. And let's see here. Job for Nginx failed because the control process exited with an error code. Let's see what the error code says. Invalid number of arguments in root directory in Nginx. Etc Nginx conf test failed. So this is telling me that in either sites enabled, because I didn't really change anything in the Nginx conf, and I think Nginx grabs the default one. In the root directive, I made some sort of mistake. So let's take a quick look at both of those files and see if we can spot it and make the fix. So let's take a quick look at the Nginx config. And I don't think I changed anything in here. So the way Nginx works is there is this Nginx config file, but the config that Nginx is running off of is really this default file in sites enabled. And that's also where we made the changes. So 5 gets you 10. That's actually where the problem is. Brian, yes, sir.
Sir, this looks like Chinese to me, but is there a semicolon required after the root directory?
You are absolutely correct. That is exactly what I missed. Let's see if that does it. Yeah, and I realized that this, and to be honest, that in a lot of ways, like using nano instead of vim and then you copying and pasting is probably the way to go here. I know this does look a bit like Chinese. Just to kind of walk through this briefly, you can set different configurations that Nginx will use. And you can sort of like create different variations on those. Awesome. Sorry about that technical difficulty, everyone. I think we were at where we were saying this Nginx config looks a little bit like Chinese, and it does look like a lot. Just to break it down, you can see that there's sort of like a keyword and then a block of configuration stuff within curly brackets. And so this keyword server is like the basic config for the Nginx server. And then all of the configuration stuff in here, all this stuff with pound signs is comments. And Nginx has various commands. And so the listen command tells Nginx what port to listen on. And that it then, I believe, uses default server settings, or that this is the configuration for the default server. But this says listen on port 80. This command root, I believe it says this is the root directory in the file system, in the Linux file system, that Nginx you should go to look for stuff. And then we can set a server name, and this is index, I believe, says what file to return by default. But the interesting stuff that we do here is location. So for location, think path, like we saw in Django. So we're saying here, when the URL is just the base path, the base root, so just, you know, aws.myec2.com, Nginx, I want you to do this. And you should actually use this other directory as root. And it's a little repetitive, but the goal here is not to mess with defaults too much and change it simple. So we're telling Nginx every time it gets an HTTP request, go to this directory, this dist directory where we just put our whole front end app, and try to find files, because sometimes there might be a CSS file that the browser is requesting. But if you can't find the requested file, return index.html, which is the right default, right? Because we want our front end server to send back index.html, and then it grabs everything else. And if for some reason that fails as well, return a 404. And then it's just a whole bunch of comments here as well. So fingers crossed. And let's see if I lost my SSH connection. Nope, I'm actually good. I'm still in here. I was just missing a semicolon at the end of that one line. And let's run the command to restart Nginx again, which is sudo service Nginx restart. And we got no error, which is awesome. So now, fingers crossed, we can actually look at our React app, because we have an Nginx server running that's hosting our front-end application. So if I take this URL and put it into the browser, there we go. And so all of you feel more than free to take that URL, and you should be able to open up it in your own browsers as well. And this is a great time to pause for questions. Now, we haven't set up Django, right? So if I try to do anything that talks to Django, I will get an error. Like if I try to log in, we get a network error because our React app tried to talk to the Django server, but we haven't set that up yet. Yeah, and I know that there was a bit of a journey to get here, so let's tackle a couple questions. Will, yes, sir.
Yeah, that was actually going to be my question, because I was going to ask how, since that server location didn't specify the Django URL const, like how would it be able to find that?
Yeah, exactly. That's a great question. So point number one is we haven't set it up. But point number two, and what we're going to do in just a minute is way down here, this. What we're going to add to that Nginx config is another location rule before the root rule that says, hey, if the URL starts with API, proxy it, send it somewhere else. 000 is just Nginx's way of saying the same computer, but port 8000. And guess what we're going to have running on port 8000 on this machine? Our Django API server. So that's a great question, Will, and that's exactly where we're going. There's a little bit of setup with Gunicorn to do with Django, but then we're going to modify the Nginx config so that any URL, any HTTP request that starts with /API gets proxied and forwarded to Django. And that's where the URL patterns and having /API starts to matter, because now Nginx can tell what's a Django API request and what needs to go to the Django API and what's not. And so it knows when to send our React app back to the browser versus sending the request onto the Django API. And then what this proxy pass does is the Django API sends its response back to Nginx, and Nginx actually sends it back to the browser. So I do apologize because somewhere in my 1,000 tabs, my tail draw was not quite on point, because really what happens is these get proxied. And I know this is a little hard to see, but I can update it a bit. So indeed, it is actually Nginx that is sort of the server that faces the world for everything. And all our requests to Django go through Nginx. Does that help answer your question, Will?
Yeah, gotcha. Thanks.
Yeah, great question. Great question. What other questions do folks have? Okay, I know it was a bit of a journey to get here, but we are now off and cooking. Let me take a quick look at our questions channel, actually. Cool. Are we ready to roll on and get Django and Gunicorn set up? Cool. And I think we're almost at the end of this journey. So the sticking point was really that SSH key. So I do apologize about that digression. Just to recap what we did with Nginx, really this stuff was all already there. We did not change it. The real change, and I will go ahead and note this, is in this location root. And in fact, let me go ahead and update our notes right now. And this will go right here. And this is our, so Nginx changes to Etsy, Nginx sites enabled default. Because if we wanted to, we could have multiple different Nginx configurations in here. And basically, we don't need to touch stuff. We change this root line here. So that it has this at the end. And then we add index.html to the end of try files. You can leave the equals 44 in the default settings. And I'll add a note, don't forget the semicolons at the end of the lines, like I did. So we can all learn from my mistake there. So hopefully seeing a little bit of that debugging was useful. And then we need to copy React app build into the Nginx dir. So it's going to look like this. So I'm going to assume this is from the home directory. So in fact, I will add here just the cd to home command and deployment app lesson / backend / dist. So this becomes deployment app lesson / backend / dist into HTML. And I'll just add we might as well add the command to actually build it. Build React app. And then we copy it in. And yes, I saw a hand up. What's up?
Sir, just a confusion, is the backend the place where the React front end is being served up?
No, that's my apologies. I just totally mistyped that. And I had a brain freeze. So this is going to be front end too. Thank you so much, Brian. And front end too. You are spot on. So these should be the exact Nginx commands that we need to run. And then restarting Nginx with I'll just copy the command here. And we can run this command anywhere. All right, so Gunicorn and Django. So Django, if Django gets too many requests at the same time, it will not handle it well because Python doesn't really do stuff concurrently. So Gunicorn is actually going to spin up multiple Django instances at the same time. Gunicorn is something called a web server gateway interface. I honestly don't know a lot about this technology. It's been around for ages. And DJ, I know you've done a lot with it, especially with Perl. But like the name implies, it lets us have our Django web server talk to Gunicorn. And so we're gonna hook up Gunicorn to Django so that we can have multiple Django processes so that if we get a bunch of requests happening at the same time, we can handle them, and we can handle them with decent performance. So this is a bit more out of scope, but again, think of Gunicorn will be creating a bunch of different processes of the same Django API server running. So Gunicorn, it's not really a load balancer, but it does something along those lines. So we have to connect Gunicorn to Django. And we actually are going to dig into a bit of our code that we normally don't touch in this .wsgi file, this web server gateway interface file. It's, I guess, a standard interface for how web servers communicate with Python. As I said, to be honest, I have not touched this a lot. I do think it can be used. I think it's a standard way for all sorts of different programming languages to talk to web servers. So what we're going to do is we're going to modify this WSGI file so it can talk to Gunicorn. So it looks like all we have to do, in fact, I apologize, is we're not even going to modify the WSGI file. If I hop back over to, just as a reminder, let's look at our project repository, and we can take a look at this backend code that we're talking about. And let's go to deployment lesson, because this has all the changes. And if we go here, it's probably in the Django project directory. There's this WSGI.py file. And so this is what we're going to hook Gunicorn up to. So because we did take a couple steps around in this journey, I do want to make sure that I installed Gunicorn. So I think that that step is not here, and that one may need to be added. So let's find out. If I type Gunicorn, do we get anything at all? So let's go ahead and install Gunicorn. And I'll add this to our notes here in the README as well. So I do apologize that the notes are a little all over. So Gunicorn is installed, suggested packages, Python 3 Gunicorn, which is great. These other packages I'm less worried about. Do we want to continue? Yes, we do. And we're gonna hit enter. And now if I type Gunicorn, I should get something, which is perfect. So now what we're gonna do is we are going to bind Gunicorn to port 8000, which, remember, is the port that we've configured our Django API to be listening on. So we're gonna, through this WSGI tool, basically connect Gunicorn to Python and have Gunicorn be hosting, I'd rather connect Gunicorn to Django and have Gunicorn be hosting our Django application on port 8000. And this command daemon is, a daemon is, you'll also hear it called like a service. And the idea is a program running in the background. And this is because all this technology was created in the 70s. Daemon is sort of the old school writing of daemon, and it comes from this idea of like Maxwell's daemon or something. But the idea is, you know, some sort of minion doing work for you in the background, which is exactly what Gunicorn is going to do, because we're going to have Gunicorn and Django running as a background service, so it does not occupy our entire terminal. So let's go ahead and run this command. And now if I do PS, so I think there are a couple other steps here that I have to do to get this up and running. So we will circle back, I think, to my guess is we maybe have to do a run command with Gunicorn, but because we have a little more Nginx setup to do, we might as well tackle this first. So here, as mentioned with your question, Will, we are now going to tell Nginx when it should pass stuff over to our Django API. Add this to user, and let me make sure I get the right directory here as I'm typing this. Etsy Nginx sites enabled. So to Etsy Nginx sites enabled, which stores the config files that Nginx actually uses, its default config, add inside the server block. So server was already there. We don't touch other stuff. And we add this before location slash. The information about how Nginx will know what goes to the Django API. This tells Nginx to send HTTP requests starting with API in the URL to port 8000 where Django is. And then over here, this already exists. And I'm just adding this here just so we know that it's there. As an example. And then we'll, of course, need to restart Nginx again. And I believe it's with like sudo service. Let's see what the command is. Sudo service Nginx restart. So I do apologize. The Route53 and Certbot stuff, we probably will have to get to after lunch or maybe tomorrow morning, because I think that will be good to walk through, but there's a couple more steps, but we can at least get to the heart of this. So let me go ahead and modify Etsy Nginx sites enabled default. And now what we add here is, and to scroll back up so I can use this as a reference to make sure I get this right. Location slash API. And I've got the semicolon at the end. And I think all that looks good. I do just need my closing curly bracket. And that worked without throwing an error. So that's a good sign. So now let's try hitting like, let's just hit an API endpoint and see if we get something from Django. So let's see, this gave us a 502 bad gateway. So I suspect maybe the Gunicorn has not been spun up And I'm going to confirm this by looking at the network tab, and we'll see what happens when I try to log in. And I'm 90% sure what we'll get is some sort of bad gateway request. So it looks like the responses don't give us as much information as we want, but putting the API URL directly in, or we could use Thunder Client to do this as well. That does tell us what we want, because we know this is coming from our Nginx, so we know we're getting to Nginx, but something is going wrong there. And since I was already kind of wondering about Gunicorn, I suspect that that's the issue. So let's do a quick hop over to, and DJ, Nginx definitely does have a log. I'm pretty darn sure that the missing step here is like actually turning Gunicorn on. So let's see kind of what the docs say here. So we installed Gunicorn, so that should be good to go. A Gunicorn command is available, which starts the Gunicorn server process to pass it the location of a model containing a WSGI application, which for Django project would look like this. It requires that your project be on the Python path, blah, 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 blah. But the simplest way to ensure this is to run the command from the same directory as your managed py file. So I wonder if I got this wrong when I ran the command and I didn't run it from the right spot. So let's try this again, because I was not seeing. So there's a command that you can use, ps-au, or pop. There are a couple commands to see the running processes. And ps-e. So like this is all the processes running on Linux right now. And I can filter it with by piping it and then using grep. And so I know Nginx is running, but there's no Gunicorn. And so that's why I suspect I just never started Gunicorn properly. So that's going to be my starting point. And then if that doesn't work, I may look at the Nginx logs. So let's go into our backend directory. And here in manage.py, let's run the Gunicorn command again. And in fact, I'll hop back over to our docs and look at this command. And indeed, I just copied and pasted this command. And this right here, project WSGI, I am pretty sure it needs to be the name of the project or something like that. Because if I look at, yeah, so I think I just missed that, and I'll update our docs. Because here I see my project, and if we want like a sort of final sanity check, we can look at these other docs from DigitalOcean that actually are quite good. And I'm sure somewhere in here, what they're going to tell us is that when you run Gunicorn, we should use the name of the project. So let's try Gunicorn to do underscore proj WSGI with this command here. So let's try Gunicorn to do underscore proj dot WSGI dash dash bind 0.0.0.0 8000 Damon. And it looks like maybe did I just misspell Damon? So that seems to have worked. If we do ps-e, now down here, I do see processes for Gunicorn running. So now I have confidence that Gunicorn is actually up and running. And if I hop over, I realize I have a zillion tabs open. So if I look at, here's the URL for our EC2 app, and then I stuck API/login, I get internal server error. So still an error, but at least a step forward. Because we know that Gunicorn is running. And if we, I wonder if we try to log in and we actually send something in the network request, if it'll work. Because that internal server error could have come because I was trying to log in, but I wasn't passing a username or password. So unfortunately, no, it looks like we're still getting some sort of error. So I wonder if this is
Did you sign that user up yet in the new database?
oh, that's an excellent point. I may not have signed the new user up. In fact, I didn't at all. Yeah, thank you, DJ, because that's, I'm so used to having that data there from the database on my machine. So there still is probably a problem because I would have expected maybe a different response from Django than the error, but I'm honestly not sure. Let's try that sign up. And Brian, one moment. Let's see if let's see where we go with this. No, so unfortunately this one failed as well. Brian, yes, sir.
I noticed a little difference with the URLs up at the top. It looks like it could be like users/sign up or something, like to match whatever the URL paths are.
Oh, so that, if I'm using the React app, that should not matter because this is just the front end routing, and we can see in the request here it went to like HTTP 127.0.0.1 8000/API user sign up. And this is actually maybe a good case for Thunder client. Because this is really how, and this is actually a good example of how you are going to want to test this kind of stuff is. So now I have what should be a valid sign up request to my endpoint. And if I hit send, I get, let's see.
That's the local host.
Oh yeah, that one needs to be changed. And actually that raises a good point. So that is actually something that we need to change in our front end code. So I apologize. We actually need to get there. And that's probably our next step. Before we do that, let's see if this gets us anywhere. So we got a 405 not allowed, and we got it from Nginx. So that kind of tells me that my Nginx, I don't think like my Nginx to Django connection is what it should be.
The log might provide details on that. I'm used to looking that stuff up, and whenever I get 500 errors with Apache, I usually go for the log because they're usually pretty detailed.
Yeah, let's go into, I agree, var log Nginx. And let's look at error.log. And we see those, we see the get for the login requests. What about access.log? And here's the sign up one. And in fact, I think, what is it? Is it like top access? I can't remember.
You're looking for head or tail?
Yeah, tail, I think. Well, I'll just use Vim for simplicity. So let's look at the Nginx log. So we see here.
A lot of times what I do is I just rename the file, because if there's no file there, it'll just create a new one, then you'll have a clean log file.
Yeah, that's a good idea. Let me go ahead and delete both of these. And let's send this request again.
It's got a confirmation.
Oh, I see. Yes. Sudo rm. And I realize we're at time, so I think if I don't get this resolved in like the next 5 minutes, we'll break and we'll return to it after lunch. And let me bring my terminal back down to size here so I can see Thunder client. And there's my Thunder client request that I want. So we send the request. That's unfortunate that it's not.
That's odd. It should have recreated them.
Interesting. I hope I didn't screw something up there. But if
Try running it again now that you got the files there. Maybe it didn't have access to create files. That's kind of weird though.
LSL. So what is it? Chmod.
Trying to change the ownership.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I don't
That's
think
ch own, but it should. What's the user? It's running as the Ubuntu user,
there
right?
we go. Yeah, there we go. I restarted the Nginx service. So lesson learned, we probably don't want to delete the files entirely, though I think restarting the service did it. So here I do have a log now in access.log for the sign up. And it just says like 405. Oh, well, among other things, I have a slash there. So if that is the problem, then that's going to kill me. Though the fact that this request is hanging this long tells me that there's probably some other sort of issue. But I did have a typo. So we'll see what happens here. But this isn't a good sign that this is hanging this long. So I suspect there's something I need to dig into to get these two connected. I think what I'll do is let me just go ahead and show how to the quick and dirty way to change our front end code so it will point to the right domain instead of 127.00.1. There is and then that'll probably be a good stopping point. So there is a way to do this with environment variables. But on a practical level, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to grab this whole domain name right here. And let's see, and And I think the way that I will do it is I think I'll actually put it in the code for the Git repo on this deployment lesson branch. So let's open up, let me see where I am. So now I'm actually on my own machine. And let's go ahead and let's open up front end source. And what we're going to change is our Axios in utilities. And I'll leave that there just as a reference, but we now want it to look like this. So this is base URL for deployed app on AWS, and this is base URL for local dev. There is a way to use actually a front-end environment variable to make this change, but for now, especially as it's on like a deployment related branch, this is fine. And now I'll do git add front-end source utilities JSX git commit add AWS URL to front-end app and push that code. And now what I am going to have to do over here is on the server, do a git pull, and I can tell that I got the change to utilities, but my front end code has changed, so I do have to run that build command again. So I'm going to do npm run build, and it's going to take a minute. And I do have to now copy the new version of the build into the Nginx directory so that Nginx has the updated version of that build. And let's see, this is just because I'm in a different directory. So let's just navigate to my home directory and run that copy command again. So that should be good. And I'm just going to restart Nginx just for the heck of it. And now I do want to confirm that my app is still working. So I should be able to still go to my home page. Yep. And now if I do sign up, it's still going to fail, I think, because of whatever the other problem is. But in the network request, we shouldn't see 127.0.0.1. And indeed, now we see that my front-end app sent the request to where we want it to go, the port 8000 on my sign-up page. And while it's still not working for, I think, something related to my Nginx config, we have done the last step to update our front-end app to talk to our actual Django API server on AWS. And yeah, unfortunately, I think I would maybe need to poke around in some other log files to get this working. And it is 20 past the hour. So it's frustrating because we're so close. I suppose what we can do is Linux make process foreground.
That should be FG with the process number, if I remember correctly.
Yeah. So let's see if we can't actually Gunicorn view logs. So let's see if we can't see the Django errors from Gunicorn. Yeah, so we haven't configured logging. So this is where logging actually becomes really useful. Because it lets us see these things. But let's see if the FG command works with either of those Gunicorn processes. If we do ps-e, so Gunicorn is both of these. So let's just try no, unfortunately, that didn't seem to do it. Yeah, I think let's pause here, folks. I do apologize because I would love to get this working. Oh, we could change, actually. Let's try one last thing. This is a little bit of the hacky way, but we will change our Django server settings back to true. Oh, actually, folks, I do apologize. I am pretty sure I know what the problem is. So, or at least I know what a problem is. I did not create an env file. I apologize. I totally forgot about that step. So that certainly would cause problems because Django does not have an env file to use. So let's generate a Django secret key. Let's do it from the command line. Let's put that secret key in our env file. And let's set debug to true. And then let's restart Gunicorn just to be safe. So I don't even know if we need to restart actually, because I think Django will read those fresh. So let's just try this request and see if this works. And unfortunately, it looks like we're still hanging. So I'm all out of trick, folks. I will keep working and debugging on this. So I do apologize that we didn't get there and we ran a bit long. We definitely should stop now. So just to recap, while we did not quite get all the pieces working, and I think I will set a time so that we can walk through setting up Route53 and Certbot, because while these are mostly clicking through stuff online, there are a couple of command line commands that we have to do to add the Certbot certification and update our front end routing once we have a domain name. But we did manage to get awfully far. Just to kind of recap what we covered. We've kind of seen what our deployment looks like. We've seen how to set it up, how to create an AWS EC2, how to connect through SSH, installing all the Ubuntu dependencies, and along the way realizing that we might need to set up a GitHub SSH key. Setting up Nginx with React, Gunicorn and Django, and I'll paste the proper command there. Tweaking Nginx to have that front end routing so that our API calls will get sent to Django and Gunicorn. And now I have a little debugging to do here that I'll follow up with folks. And then we have these last two Route53 and Certbot steps. And I think I'll find some time to do that as well. But we managed to cover an awful lot of ground. So thank you very much, folks, for sticking around. let's definitely break here for lunch because we've gone 20 past the hour. And I'll see you all after lunch for some behavioral interview practice. So let me go ahead and pause the recording. All right, so we're going to finish off learning how to deploy our full stack application onto AWS. We got pretty far. There's some bug that needs to be worked out with Gunicorn and Django, but they are hooked up. And remember that, let's see if I can find the URL. We got a lot of things done. No, I don't want to update my shell right now. We got the React app hosted on an EC2 instance, and we installed Nginx and Postgres and Django, and we cloned our Git repo down there. We ran into the Git SSH key issue, which I eventually sorted out. And we set up our front-end application to be able to make back-end calls on this branch. And I think that's maybe a good thing to briefly revisit to help ourselves warm up. Where in Axios, we changed our base URL to be the domain of our virtual Linux machine, our EC2 server in the cloud. And that the architecture we're using now has Nginx serving up our front-end application to the browser, and all of our API calls get sent to Nginx, and Nginx is the middleman that sends them to Django and then sends them back to the browser and the user. So to kind of pick up where we went off, I am going to sign back into the AWS console. And I just always search for like AWS console and click one of the links, and there's inevitably a log back in, and I'm logged in, and I've got the EC2 instance that I created here that's still running. I should have stopped it just to cut down on the number of like free minutes I'm using. There's some monthly free tier, but that's fine for today. And again, if I go to actions, I could do things like start or stop my instance. So I could stop it, I could reboot it. If I click on the instance here and hit connect, I have a number of options to connect. With EC2 Connect, this would open up a terminal in the browser, but we actually want to use SSH. And we had created an SSH key, and I put it in my .ssh directory. And it can, this is the recommended place to put it, but it will work anywhere, as long as when I run the SSH command, I give it the right path to where the file lives. And so I'm going to SSH back into my EC2 instance so I can continue work in there. And I'm just going to have a terminal open on my machine too, and I'll name this to just local dev so I don't get the two confused. And with my front-end app, if I do sign up, and we look in the network tab, we can see that the request gets sent to the right spot. And let me go ahead actually and do some tiling. The URL looks like that we're sending the request to. It's getting sent to the server off of the API endpoint. Before this was localhost. But something is wrong with Gunicorn and Django, and the request is timing out. I haven't had a chance to look into what the mistake is there. Chances are it is like one line in the Nginx config file that's wrong. So I will circle back to that. But the pieces that we're going to do to finish this up is using AWS Route53 to create a domain name, and then also using Certbot to and excuse me one moment while I grab a tab, and using Certbot to create an SSL certificate so we can have our connection be HTTPS. So Route53 will create a domain name for our website. And then we will connect it to our EC2. So I'm going to go over to the console and I'm going to search for Route53. And let's see. Now, I'm not sure actually if this will cost us money or not, but let's try like maybe CP full stack deployment.edu. And it would help if I had a proper top level domain with the .edu at the end. So this is where I don't think there's a way around spending money, though I could be wrong. But I think we're gonna have to end up buying a domain name. And it's actually not the worst to buy your own domain name, and then you can use it for your personal website. That can be your portfolio page. And I think that actually kind of adds a level of professionalism. I think for the moment, what I will do is we'll do something like CP sweep immersive.com. Because that's actually a domain name that maybe like Code Platoon could use. Note that the .org is $1 cheaper. So we'll go for .org. I believe I already have a credit card connected to this. I am going to turn off auto renew, so this will not automatically renew in 1 year. So again, this is the one step that will involve paying money, but you can then use this domain name wherever you want, not only with AWS, I believe. And you also don't necessarily have to do this. And let's see if we can actually get this filled out. And I'm just going to very briefly stop sharing my screen as I just enter my phone number and stuff, as that's actually my cell, that's the contact, though the rest of this is the Code Platoon information. And so just give me a moment here. We'll see if we can get our domain name purchased. And I do believe that was a success. And can everyone see my screen again with the domain name and VS Code? And Luis, I actually did not know about DuckDSS. This actually looks great, and my guess is that we probably can use this. That's a great find. And this looks great.
Sorry for interrupting, Adam. That's one
No,
of your
please.
dynamic DNS providers that I was mentioning before to be able to assign a domain name to your personal computer. That's how you do it right there.
Oh, okay. What exactly is dynamic DNS actually?
With you connected to your ISP assigns you a new public IP address every time you connect. There's a
Right.
utility you can run in the background that'll continue to update this service to keep you pointed, to keep a domain name pointed to the correct one. It constantly updates it.
Got it. That is very cool. And I think EC2 does that I think the domain name with the EC2 instance stays the same if I stop and restart it, but I'm actually not 100% on that. This does look awesome. I probably cannot. Luis, maybe you can help, but if this isn't like a 2-click operation, I'm not sure if I can demo using it right now, unfortunately, because this looks really cool. Have you used this before? Oh, okay. Yeah, let's try registering with the Google account. I see you're saying it's fast in the chat. Please complete the reCAPTCHA. Okay, we can do that. And actually, this will look great. And someone was asking about subdomains versus domains, and this is a good example of that too. And so let's do CP full stack and see if it's around. Okay, so that's added to my Google account. So I think the next question here then becomes, do I have to tell Route53? So we probably shouldn't expose this token information and stuff. But that's okay. And Luis, I see you're saying in the chat, and current IP just put in. I see. Okay, perfect. This is even better. So this is actually pretty great, folks. So if you want to, you absolutely can purchase a domain name. And I think indeed I got back the response already from the Amazon registrar from the domain that I purchased. Though I'm not sure if it actually takes a little bit of time or anything for that to propagate. But DuckDNS is, I think, a great starting point. And Luis, thank you so much for guiding me through this in the chat. And DJ, thank you as well for some additional context and reminders around what these things are doing. And so if I go over to, let's hop back from Route53 to EC2. So let's go back to our EC2 instance. And I think what I should be able to do is grab the public, here we go, the public IPv4. Oh, let's see, did my instance stop?
Was that the DNS that you were clicking or the address? Your public IP4 address is in the middle on the bottom there. Right in, oh, you passed by it. Just above the
Thank you so
instance
much.
state.
Yeah.
No, just, that's the domain right up in there, just above your cursor, right there.
Yeah, so I'm actually a little surprised because this was working just a moment ago. Did our thing, let's see, is this still running? Oh, so this is there. So this should work as a host. And DuckDNS, yeah, we're gonna need to give it an IP. The one thing I wonder here is if DuckDNS, it sounds like DuckDNS might handle the IP address changing. And it sounds like DJ, you were saying we probably want to use the public IPv4 address. Does that sound about right?
I'm not 100%, but I mean, traditionally dealing with DNS as any with a server without a domain name, that should be right. Yeah, and Luis just commented too.
Got it. Thank you. Does Luis, this public IPv4 DNS doesn't work in there, does it? Do you happen to know? Yeah, let's just run with
that service is going to be mapping that IP address to the subdomain, so it needs the actual IP address.
Yeah. Now, I'm not sure. I do think this IP might change if we kill and restart the EC2 instance, but let's see how far we go. So now the IP address is mapped. So now if we put in HTTP, look at that. Luis, that's awesome. Thank you. So to recap, DuckDNS, we can sign up and create an account. And then we add in a subdomain that we're interested in. So like my domain or my name, and then it will be myname.duckdns.org. And once we do that, we pass the IP address. And the way we can find the IP is if you click on the instance and then you go here to where it says the public IP version 4 address and copy that. That's what we then would put into DuckDNS. Now, what I'm not sure if when we reboot the instance, I think that public IP, no, it looks like it's the same. So I think we're good for now. And it certainly gets us moving. So let's see instance state running. Though now that does not seem to work, unfortunately. I suspect they're both rebooting from. I suspect because I stopped the instance state, those are waiting. And let me do like a proper stop, and we'll let it stop, and then we'll restart it, and we'll try again.
Is that the elastic IP address, Adam?
I don't think we've set an elastic IP address for this. I'm not certain, but I think that you have to do that with AWS, and I'm not sure if that costs money.
Yeah, I'm just trying to Google if their IP addresses are dynamic or not.
Got it. Yeah. Yeah. So DuckDNS is actually quite cool. I do think what we want to do is once we have a domain name, I do think we want to put it into Route53. It looks like this domain registration is still in progress. I also think with Certbot, we may need. I'm not sure if we need the domain registered with Route53 for Certbot to point to the domain. So let's see. My instance is stopped. Let's go ahead and start it up again. Oh, Luis, thank you. Let's give the instance a moment to start up. And actually note how we don't have a public IP4 address at the moment because the instance is pending. And once it starts, I think it will have a new public IP, but I think it sounds like DuckDNS might be able to take care of that for us. So
you may have to run the cron job. I was just remembering you've got a Linux VM, so you would do it the same exact way you would run it in Linux.
To a cron job to
update DuckDNS. There's ever since the mid 90s, Linux has had a dynamic DNS updater to be able to use these services. And it's like a cron job, that Linux cron job right there. It would just fire off and send out a transmission to DuckDNS with your credentials and update the actual domain name. That's how I used to do it with my system.
Got it. Okay. This is cool. This does have a couple more steps. So I may, and I'm not sure why everything is running really slow at the moment. I may come back to that one. I apologize that let's see if it says this is in progress. I wonder if we are able to use this one though. So it looks like this is registered. Let's hop over to maybe the EC2. Yeah, I might just run with this one just to demo it out. We'll see if I circle back to the duck DNS stuff. Though that does look extremely cool. So I believe, and actually, well, that's okay if we're showing the contact information. So I do apologize, folks. I actually need to, I think, do a quick Google search on how to connect this to the EC2. And let's see kind of what Amazon says. So there's a couple steps here that we're gonna have to follow. It looks like, I think, to get this set up so that the EC2 will point to this with Route53. The duck DNS one does look a bit, it does look a bit tempting.
It looks like there might be packages out available if you don't want to do it that way too. It looks like there's plenty of options on being able to set up the updater.
Yeah, this, I'm sure that if we followed this, it would work and be pretty straightforward. There's just a lot of pieces here, so I don't think I want to open this door at the moment. Though it's not as if the Route53 step doesn't have pieces either. But here, at least, I think then we can demo setting it up with Route53 and EC2. So the duck DNS is super cool. I may come back to that one. So I think I'll just kind of talk through these steps and what's going on here, in part because that's just a little bit more what I'm familiar with, to be totally honest. So the first thing that I'm doing here is when an EC2 instance is created, it gets assigned to like a region, and AWS has different regions such as US East and stuff like that. And let's see if I do a little search for region. There should be, so it's hiding all the way up here. But so this actually is like different AWS regions and they cost different amounts. I think US East to Ohio is fairly inexpensive. And so this too, as you create servers, like if we were scaling up, you could put them in different areas of the world. So this EC2 instance was created in US East 2. And it does look like, do I need to do something with an elastic IP? What we're going to do, I think, is grab that public IPv4 address and we're going to bring it over to Route 53. And so here I've got the domain name that I registered. And I want to make sure that it's in the right region. And then I think I want to create a policy for it or create a record. Here we go. So here we can enter the domain name that we're going to use. And we're creating what's called an A record that's going to route traffic from some IP address to some resource. And so I don't think we actually need to add anything for the subdomain. But here in value, we are going to paste in the IP address of the EC2 instance. And we may actually run into the same kind of issue that we did with DuckDNS, to be honest, with stopping and restarting this EC2. And that's actually what like an elastic IP address is for, I think, to solve this problem. But just to get this ball rolling, let me at least get the IP address in here and get this set up and see if it's working. So it looks like this record was created. It might need a minute, like before anything actually shows up. Yeah, I think that status pending here means that I think this record needs to be propagated, which can take some time, though hopefully it won't take too long. So we'll give it a minute and see how it goes. And so we've now just created what's called an A record that links an IP address to a domain name. Yeah, the DuckDNS stuff does look cool. I think that that's a bridge to be crossed later. Though the really nice thing about it is it's free. And yeah, so an elastic IP address is an IP address that won't change. That's designed for computing so that like we can stop and restart our EC2 and have the same IP address. So let's actually see about creating an elastic IP. So if we want to create an elastic IP, and I'll pull this over here. I realize that this is a bit of a mess, so I do apologize. We're still in the console, but we're gonna go to, they call it network and security. And there's all these different things here that we're not going to worry about at the moment, but we're going to look for Elastic IP. And actually, I wonder if I just search for it in here. Even better is we can just use the console to go right to it. And we're going to need to allocate to create a new Elastic IP address. Whatever this accelerator is, I don't think we need to worry about it. I'm not going to worry about tags, but I'll just do deployment lesson. And let's go ahead and create it. And so now this is an IP address that will not change. But now we do need to connect it to our EC2 instance. And I believe we would do that with associate Elastic IP. And here I can choose, and I get a nice handy drop down, the EC2 instance that I already created. And I think that should do it in terms of associating. And so that was successful. And so now my EC2 should have an Elastic IP that won't change when I stop and restart it. So I actually want to update that A record that I just created. And let's see if we look at the EC2, if we can see the Elastic IP on it. And indeed, it's hiding over here, Elastic IP address. And if I paste it in, I see that this works. And I'm not going to do it now in the interest of time, but now I can stop and restart my EC2 and have the same IP address. So the Elastic IP is actually super handy. And I think I am going to go back to Route 53 now that we have this Elastic IP. And to be honest, we could use the Elastic IP with Duck DNS too. Although I know it's, its intent was sort of for dynamic DNSs. The fact that it actually gives you a free subdomain really easily is really nice. So I would recommend making an Elastic IP, and then if you want, you could add it here to Duck DNS to get the domain name, or if you want to buy a domain name, you could do it that way. And let's go ahead and see if we're able to modify our policy. And I can't stand I do apologize. I can't stand the AWS console. Somewhere in here. Is a way, I think, to modify our record. I might need a quick Google assist here if we search for like Route 53, modify a record. So it looks like I need to go over to what they call hosted zones. And there we go. That's what I was looking for. So hopefully you won't have to modify the record because you'll just create the Elastic IP first. But if you do want to, look up the directions on how to do it, and then in the navigation pane, go to hosted zones, and we choose the row that we want, and then we can go ahead and hit edit. And now we should be able to edit this record. I do apologize. This is driving me a little mad. And I wonder if we can just like maybe create a new record instead. So I feel like we're almost there, but now filter records by property or value, created by Route53, record count 3. I will come back to that later. I apologize. I don't want to go down too much of a rabbit hole here because we currently I think this is still updating anyway. We have this IP address working though, so we can go ahead and set up Certbot to at least create an SSL certificate. So I think I'm just going to move ahead with that, and we can see what that's like, because I don't want to get too lost in the mix with this. But let me go ahead and actually just pull up Certbot here so we can see what we're doing. I'm just going to follow the Certbot instructions here, and we're running Nginx on, it's almost definitely Ubuntu 20. And in fact, I'll go in here to our SSH one and confirm. And I believe I can use a command through a quick Google search, uname -a. And it looks like my SSH connection was terminated because I restarted this EC2 at some point. So let's SSH back in. And actually, it looks like the EC2 may not be running at all, which actually would explain a couple issues. So let's do a quick check. Let's hop over to EC2 and look at my instances. And it is running right now. It is possible. I wonder if this changed, and indeed it did. The domain name changed as well. So that's actually why my SSH was failing. And this is part of why making an elastic IP is nice. And now I can SSH in. No, it looks like my SSH actually failed. Interesting. Let's do this the other way. We'll just click on this. Instance summary, connect, SSH client. Let's just copy this command, put it in VS Code. There we go. So I must have had some sort of typo there. But now I'm SSH back in. And we're running on version 22 of Ubuntu. So Ubuntu 20 should be fine. And it looks like Certbot is not taking us to our next steps here. So I may switch gears and just run this from the command line. Because I thought that this might take us and give us a nice guide. There we go. That's what I was looking for. So we can just see here, they walk us through the steps. We've SSH'd in. We do need to install this program called Snapd. And I'm honestly not certain what Snap does, but it looks like it's sort of a package manager on steroids. And it looks like it's probably pre-installed on Ubuntu, in fact. And if I just type in Snap here, I see a bunch of commands. And so that tells me that Snap's installed. So then we can kind of move on to the next step here with the Certbot instructions, where it's saying to run snap install classic Certbot. And now we're going to run this command that is basically a test command to make sure that Certbot is working. And let me go ahead and just make this larger and get rid of that. And I am just going to copy and paste this command. And I do recommend doing this for Certbot. And I didn't get an error thrown, so I think we're doing okay here and we can move on. And so let's run sudo certbot for Nginx. And Certbot actually works with this service called Let's Encrypt, which is pretty amazing. And there's a nice website for it. And I believe that's what Let's Encrypt like creates the SSL certificate. I will add my email here just in case. I don't know if you have to. I am going to say that we read the terms of service. Will I share my email with the Electronic Frontier Foundation, which is one of the big open source organizations and is actually pretty great. I will probably get spammed by them, but yes, why not? So now we can please enter the domain name we'd like on our certificate. So now this is where like having a domain name set up does become more useful. And let's see what the status of our domain is. I suspect it is still getting registered. We can do a quick check here to see that we have these 3 servers. And here are the records. And this is what I was trying to get to before that was driving me a little nuts. I'm not sure what I was doing wrong or if maybe these hadn't been created yet. But now I think I should be able to finally change that A record actually back to the Elastic IP. And this is what I was searching for that was driving me a little mad before, because we're going to hit edit record and we're going to add in our Elastic IP address here. So now I can hop back to my EC2. And now I can go to my EC2 instance. And now I can copy my Elastic IP address and put it in the A record for my cert. And just as a sanity check, I'll paste that in here too. I see that the Elastic IP is indeed up and running. And just as like an extra sanity check, I'll make sure that I indeed copied the Elastic IP. And I'll go ahead and hit save. And so now it's successfully updated. Route 53 propagated all your changes to all the Route 53 DNS servers within, propagates within 60 seconds. So we see the status is pending. So we'll give it 60 seconds and hopefully that'll work out. And while it's doing that, we're going to go ahead and use this domain with Certbot and add that for what we're requesting the certificate for. And I apologize that that was a couple extra steps, but now we should have an SSL certificate set up for our domain that we created. And again, you could use DuckDNS to create the domain. I don't think that would cause any problems. The key step was actually creating an Elastic IP address to connect to the EC2 so that when I stop and restart that EC2 instance, I have a consistent IP address. So I think that will make life a little simpler. Though DJ and Luis, the approach that you guys were saying of just use DuckDNS and kind of run the Linux commands to automatically update stuff, I think would work as well, because it's the domain name that's the important thing with the certificate. So we can see there here that we've created a certificate. It's been deployed. Note that over here it says successfully deployed certificate to /etc/nginx/sites enabled/default to our default Nginx config. And note that this certificate also is a .pem file. So just like with our SSH key, this is a probably a private key. Our certificate has an expiration date. Certbot has a scheduled task. And if we're curious, we can go ahead and take a look at the Nginx config to see what it looks like with the certificate enabled on it. And it should be. There we go. And over here, in fact, we can see what's been added. So this is a lot of stuff we probably don't want to touch. In fact, there's a lot of things that's been added here by Certbot, the server name, and then Certbot has added all of these things inside here. Or rather, excuse me, I'm so sorry. Certbot added to our existing server block configuration this line here. This is what we added before that has something not quite right with it to pass HTTP requests to Django. And we'll have to circle back to that one. And then here's the try files command. And I do wonder if it's this 404 at the end that's causing the issue, because that actually was not in the curriculum. Though I wouldn't imagine it is. I think I will not try and mess with too much stuff at once. And then if I scroll further down, I can see that Certbot has added these lines that we don't really want to touch. But what we can see is that it points to these private keys for the SSL certificate that have been added. So the fact that Certbot does that stuff for us is actually really, really nice. And I'm going to go ahead and restart Nginx just to be on the safe side. Though my guess is that Certbot already did that for us. And I'm curious if this is working. And there we go. Now we are finally working and we have our domain name set up, and note the all important HTTPS here. and that it is indeed like an HTTPS encrypted connection. So there is one more change that we have to make, because in my client code, if I go to sign up and we look in the network tab, the sign up goes to this domain name. And I'm not even sure if we can directly access that domain name anymore now that we've set up the elastic IP address. And more importantly, we've set up Route 53, because Route 53 is pointing to this domain that we created. So again, it's actually really nice to have this as an environment variable in your front end code. And I think I don't want to try and hack that in. It's not actually that difficult, but we can just use the same workflow that we did before, where we changed this base URL in our code and pushed it up and pulled it down and recommitted. So I'm going to go ahead and make that change one more time with a domain name now of cp-swe-immersive.org. And so this base URL now becomes cp-swe-immersive.org/API. And I do now need to, and this is on my computer. And let me navigate.
Does that base URL need HTTPS in front of it now too?
Oh, it totally does. Thank you so much, DJ. I totally forgot about that. Yeah, we want the HTTPS. Thank you. And there's all these PyCache files that we will ignore. And the thing we care about that we've changed is our utilities JSX with our Axios API. So let me just do git add front end to, and actually I wonder if maybe this is the problem with the Nginx. Now that I'm looking at this, I wonder if I forgot the dash for front end too. Let's check that in just a minute. Source utilities JSX, git commit with a message, add new domain name to React Axios API. We'll push that up. And now over here on my EC2 instance that I'm SSH'd into, I'll go into the deployment app. I'll go ahead and I'll go into, I'll just do a git pull as I'm on the right branch. And if I do git log, I see my recent commit that I made there, which is perfect. And now let me go into the front end 2 directory and run npm run build to build a new version of the front end app. And we'll give that just a moment. And now let's actually take a quick look at our config and see if I got that directory name wrong. So this actually looks fine. Oh, DJ, yes, sir.
For the Django side, wouldn't we have to update the domain name for your backend database too?
No, I don't think so. I don't think there's anything in Django settings related to the domain name, because Django actually, so the database is running on the same EC2 instance. So that is, I think, a non-issue, and it would be Django initiating that connection anyway. So as long as Django knows how to talk to the database, then we're set. Does that make sense if I'm understanding your question correctly?
Yeah, I was just trying to see if I could help with the other issue.
Oh, thank you. I don't think that's it, though. That's a good point. I should check to make sure that the database looks good and that we set it up correctly. Let me go ahead and run the copy command again. So I'm in the front end directory. So let's do copy -r dist into /user/share/nginx/html. And I need to do a sudo with that. And let's actually double check that nginx user share nginx html. User share nginx html. Now, unfortunately, that looks correct. It would have been nice if that was the issue. But now if I do a hard refresh now in the browser to grab the newer version of this, and now let's go ahead and submit. We see here that the post request now goes to our domain name, which unfortunately is still not working, and I'm not quite sure why, but we've added more pieces to the puzzle. And I think I will do a quick, let's do todo_tv. So this looks like it has all the tables, and the database name looks right, todo_db. DJ, let's see actually if we do need to change anything in here. If we do vim backend to-do proj settings py. So I think this is all we need to do as long as PsychoPG2, the Postgres database connector library, has been installed with Django.
What if you try to sign in a username? That's how I've been operating it on mine.
I know you mean from the browser here?
Oh, I just add in the username right here in your default. I just put the my username. I don't know if it's really required or anything. Maybe not on a local host, but maybe on the remote. I'm not sure.
It should be defaulting to using the Linux system username. I'm like 99% sure. I think we would have ran into that issue. We certainly can try. Do you remember, is it username like that? Yeah, it's tempting. I think
It's just user, sorry.
Oh, yeah, I don't think I want to try and debug it live because I think I'll end up getting stuck and going down a rabbit hole. So we almost have these pieces working. There's this one issue with Gunicorn and Django where something is not quite working right. That I will try to circle back to and debug, but it took a couple steps, but we now do have an SSL certificate set up, and we also used Route53 to create an A record for a domain name. And we absolutely could have used the domain name that we created with .dns. So Luis, thank you so much for sharing that. If we had wanted to, I could absolutely use the domain name that I created here with .dns over here when I created that A record, the cp fullstack.duckdns.org. But those are all the pieces. And I know we just hit 5 o'clock, so it's stand down time. So I do apologize that I that took a bit longer than expected. I just want to check in to see if there are any questions that we could maybe quickly tackle to either look at something fresh or answer questions before we break for the feedback form and stand down. So I just want to check in to see what's on people's minds. So just to recap, actually the most important piece here is making an elastic IP address for EC2. And the easiest way to do that is just in the AWS console, just type elastic IP and choose elastic IPs for EC2. And then you go to allocate and you just leave all this as is. You don't worry about that. You don't need a tag. Though the nice thing about the tag is it does give it a name. And then the elastic IP is an IP address that does not change. And then we can go ahead and connect it to an EC2 instance by going here to actions and doing associate elastic IP and pasting in our instance name, or if you start typing, it'll search for it and find it. All right, folks, thank you very much for sticking around through that. I appreciate it. And I hope that it was useful and also showed some of these steps. As you can see, a lot of this is just like sort of configuration clicking through. And so although there's a number of moving pieces, it's actually not that complicated. Honestly, the biggest pain I think is the AWS management console. The cool thing to see here is what's called an A record that we created, which is how you associate a domain name with an IP address. So that's really cool to see. Let me go ahead and stop the recording, and then we can maybe dive into stand down.